Well, good morning, everyone. I think we're going to get started now. Great to have you all with us. My name's Eddie Adams. I'm going to be moderating this 2020 Housing Europe conference. Forget the price tag, let's talk about the value of social housing. I'm lucky enough to be working with Housing Europe on, I think this is my 4th or 5th annual conference. It's great to see so many familiar names on our 220 odd registrations. I think when I left the event in Lyon last year, I was really excited about the fact that this year we'd be on my home turf. I'm from Glasgow in Scotland, and I was super excited about having everyone coming to Scotland and being together. And never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that we'd be doing it like this. So here we are in these strangest of circumstances. We're all on this massive learning curve. And this is, I guess, the new normal. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks for taking time out. And I know when people are digitally saturated, you have to be very selective about how you spend your time on online events. So it's great that so many people have joined us today. Even though you're not going to be with us physically in Scotland, we hope to bring you a flavour of the place. We hope to give you a sense of what Scotland looks like and the diversity and some of the exciting things which are going on here. We also hope to involve you in our sessions interactively. We're doing that in a couple of different ways. We'll be using menti.com to bring you in with some polls and creating some word clouds. We also have, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, you have a Q&A bar and a chat bar. I can see the chat bar is already operating. We'll be stopping and pausing and bringing your questions in from the Q&A. So we hope to involve you in a number of different ways. So it's not just a kind of one-way thing coming out of your screens. We'll also be looking to have a mix of different voices, different speakers. So we've got a nice format for you today running through for this morning. This is a point in the session where in real life I'd be telling you the fire drill and where the toilets are. You know that better than I do, because you know your situation in a way that we don't. So nothing else from me just now, other than to with great pleasure to welcome Sally Thomas, the Chief Executive Officer of Scottish Federation for Housing Associations. Sally, thanks so much for joining us, and the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. Delighted to be here, of course, and delighted that you're here, and delighted everyone's here, even though I can't see everybody. But hopefully we can all enjoy each other's company and learn together as the morning progresses. I want to start off by just saying a few words by way of how things seem here in Scotland and where we need to go. A home has never been more important. If we didn't know it before, we do now. Homes not only make lives, they save lives. For too long in the UK, in fact, for around 40 years, since people were given the right to buy their social homes, the end of council house building, the squeeze on public finances, and the emphasis on home ownership, housing has become something of a second-tier issue behind health, education, and policing. And social housing in particular has not had the profile and recognition it deserves, not only as a safe, secure home at an affordable cost for those who need it, but also for the social, economic, and environmental benefits it provides. A high-quality home in a successful community, in a place that works, support when you need it, and doing this from generation to generation, reinvesting the money in more affordable homes. It's housing with social justice baked into the bricks by social purpose organisations, which not only provide great homes, but do so much more. And no longer is it a second-tier issue. During the pandemic, our homes have become more important than ever. They're the places where we're living, working, studying, educating our children, and keeping our families safe and healthy. Scotland recognises this. It leads the way on legal housing rights and is striving for a better housing system in a 20-year strategy, Housing to 2040, and the ending of homelessness. The government has designated housing as a human right and an infrastructure priority. These were important ambitions before the crisis, and they are even more so now, with the climate emergency and increasing poverty and inequality. The pandemic has accelerated the need for answers and action. Not since the Second World War have we faced a time of such change, uncertainty, and crisis. Social housing provides an anchor role, stability, certainty, and reassurance in this fast-changing, unsettling world, building and sustaining whole communities and transforming places from forgettable to desirable. In short, social or public housing does what other housing providers can't or don't aspire to, not only providing a home, but making a real, tangible, and long-term difference to the places that they live in and the people who live there, helping the government meet its social, economic, environmental, and policy objectives in health and social care, child poverty, an aging population, employment, education, climate change, and inclusive growth. And the headline impact of this is increasingly visible and dramatic. In Scotland, around a fifth of our population, that's around 1.2 million people, live in social housing. Housing associations alone have a capital asset base worth £50 billion, an annual turnover of 1.5 billion, and they more than double government investment with private investment in the current housing programme from 3.2 billion to around 7 billion. And the sector also employs 15,000 people. These are seriously impressive figures. The effects of the current coronavirus crisis means that the need for affordable housing will be greater than ever, both for Scotland's people and its economy. We need social housing to help rebuild our economy, create jobs, and reinvigorate our communities. History tells us, following 2 world wars, economic depressions in the 80s and 90s, and the financial crash in 2008, that recovery is always state-led. It is governments which have to provide the leadership, the ambition, the vision, and yes, the resources to build the economy back, supported by the public and charitable sectors, and reducing the risk for the private sector to then follow on. As we've seen historically, government intervention on a huge scale is the only way to provide for the most basic and essential needs of its people, a home being perhaps the most essential. Well, if ever there was a crisis on these scales, it is now. Homes have been at the centre of the crisis and they will be at the centre of the recovery. But we need to look even beyond this, beyond the next 5 years, to the new housing system we need. Because most of all, more than anything else, we need to change the system. While Scotland has been more fortunate in the government funding needed to provide social housing than south of the border, the basic problem is the same on both sides of the border. We focus on the money needed to provide more social homes without a clear idea of what a better housing system would look like. We make brave and bold arguments for social housing, which we still contextualize within a system which is weighted against it. And it's also changing fast. Home ownership in both Scotland and England now stands at around 62%, down from 71% in England in 2003, and a high of 66% in Scotland in 2005. The private rented sector has tripled since 1999 in Scotland and doubled in England, where it's now the second largest tenure. In both countries, the number of people over 65 is set to increase by nearly 20% in the next 10 years. The housing system in the UK, in Scotland, is undergoing a fundamental shift and realignment. Much of this is indeed due to a lack of social homes, but there are other significant forces at play, including economic instability, aspirational shift, and social change, all heightened by the pandemic. In other words, we desperately need more homes, but more fundamentally, we need a new system, one which has social justice at its core for people and places. We need a positive reframing of the housing system through the lens of social justice, which puts genuinely affordable housing on equal terms with all other options, not a last resort, but part of the mainstream, which recognizes that the property ladder is a failed concept, For too many, it's no longer possible or even desirable to climb a ladder. What we need is a property democracy, not the property owning democracy of the past, but a level playing field of housing options and choices with the same standards and quality public perception in all tenures: home ownership, private rent, and social housing. Affordable housing as a positive and equal choice in a rebalanced and mature housing market, which delivers from generation to generation according to need and aspiration. The home is the bedrock upon which all other individual, collective, and national aspirations stand or fall, from where we grow and develop ourselves and our relationships, from where we build hopes and dreams for the future. An ongoing and long-term commitment to social housing on an ongoing and equal basis to private rent and home ownership is about those hopes and dreams being there for everyone. When I talk about this, especially at a time of such crisis, while I passionately believe it, I have a voice in my head which says that's impossible. But as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it's done. What has been impossible is to meet all of you, attend in person. We're so disappointed we can't show you the best of Glaswegian, hospitality, life, and of course, housing. However, with the power of technology, we can show you a short video demonstrating the breadth and diversity of our social housing here. From our highlands and islands, our cities and villages, a very big virtual welcome to Scotland to you all.
Thanks so much, Sally, for those inspirational words, and also for just picking up the scale of the challenge, you know, and the need for us to remain optimistic, but also to accept just the fundamental systemic shifts that are needed to tackle some of the issues that you've raised. And we'll be talking today about Housing 2030. We'll be getting under the skin of some of these issues in our panel discussions. But for the moment, let's keep moving on. Let's invite Brant Madsen, who's the president of Housing Europe in Denmark, not so far away from Scotland, across the North Sea. Ben, great to have you with us. So nice to see you, and the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you, Eddie, and thank you for moderating today. And thank you for the fine video. Wish we all were in Scotland now. And thank you, Sally, for your very inspirational words. It always seems impossible until it's done, you said. Wise words. And we need indeed to put social justice at the heart of our housing system, with affordable and social housing, not a last resort, but a part of the mainstream, and not as an afterthought, but at the heart of our housing systems in a complete reframing exercise. So what an excellent way to kick off the day. Thank you very much, Sally. And let me welcome you all here today. Today we convene with Housing Europe members and partners, friends and colleagues for the annual agenda-setting event for housing, and organized this year in partnership with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. Thank you very much for that. And as you know, today we are here to talk about the value of housing. We all know that real estate is a big business. In fact, one of the biggest in the whole world, attracting more than 160 trillion US dollars each year. However, today we are here to talk about another side of the business. We are here to talk and focus on the social value generated by public, cooperative, social and community-led housing. Our homes are completely critical to our health and well-being, and the pandemic leaves us without a doubt and will add to the huge amount of evidence out there already about the adverse effects and impacts of poor quality homes on people's physical health, and indeed the adverse impact on their life chances generally. We are going to be exploring over the next couple of years a world where people spend more time at home. And even if we have a universal vaccine, we have all discovered that it's much easier to do a whole lot of things from home than we thought. And if this is the case, instead of home being occupied half the time by half of the household, we might find that our homes are very heavily occupied for much greater periods of time. And the implications of this, of course, is that the need for light, space, and digital and social connectivity will become even more critical in the future. And the term adequacy will take on a new meaning from now on. And it is this backdrop, of course, that makes this work even more important now. Sally called for a reframing of the housing system to put affordable housing at the center. Well, I'm pleased to say that we can already see the start of this happening. Angel Gurria, Secretary General of the OECD, arguably one of the most influential bodies globally, in their latest report, which he will present shortly, refers favorably to the examples of broadly accessible social housing sectors that have proved more resilient and financially sustainable. The report also calls for an increased investment in the sector. And this is also a first time and may signal the start of change within the OECD, which may in turn change the whole conversation around housing. So maybe the impossible is already a little more possible than we thought. And on that optimistic note, I will give back the floor to our amazing moderator here today, Eddie Adams. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bent. Thank you. We'll just double check. Yeah, thanks for those inspiring words. And stay with us, Bent, and Sally, stay with us too. I know you're both going to join us at the end of the day, but before you disappear for the moment, we're going to change the screen and we're going to involve our audience for the first time this morning. Good that Bent mentioned the OECD, because in a few minutes' time, I'm going to invite the Secretary General, Angel Gurria, to join us. But before Senor Gurria takes the floor, we would like to engage you for the first time using our interactive tool. If you look at the top of the screen, you can see menti.com. We have an event code, 817778. So if you go to menti.com on a mobile phone or an iPad or any kind of device, and you key that code in, it will take you to our event. We'll be using this same code, the same platform throughout today. We'll be using it to get your thoughts on some of our panel topics. But first of all, we're going to create a word cloud together. Looking at the key focus of our event, our question is, let's forget about the price tag for a couple of hours. So tell us in 1 or 2 words what the social value of housing is to you. So we want you to give us some words that you think capture and represent this idea of the social value of housing. If you open up the menti.com, key in the code, you'll see it on your screen. You can give us a couple of suggestions. I think we have 3 you can key in total. I see we have 2 people who have jumped in, 3 people now. That's super. I'm going to let this run for a little bit, for maybe a minute or so, just so people can familiarize themselves. If you haven't used Menti before, then just gives you a little bit of time to see how to do this. So as I said, we'll be using this code throughout the day. The cloud we create just now, or start creating, we will put this back up, open it up during the breaks in the morning a couple of times, and we'll also be bringing the completed cloud back together to have a look at it at the end with our final panelists to reflect on what you said and what it's telling us. So I think it's a nice visual way for us to get started. And as I said before, our first panel, we'll also be using Menti to come back out to you and ask you some questions about your thoughts on that first panel topic. So I can see the numbers are clocking up slowly. We've got 23, 25. So I'm just watching those as they tick up. Don't forget, we also have other options to interact today. There's a chat bar if you want to comment or make any sort of observations or pick up anything. If you have specific questions, we have a Q&A bar at the bottom. We'll try and push the pause button. My colleagues Dara, Diana, Abdu are all part of our team keeping this show on the road today, and we'll be pausing to have a look and see what questions people have so we can bring those into our panelists, try and make this as interactive as we can within the confines of an online session. We're all on this massive learning curve, as you know, and we're trying to find new ways of making these events as human as possible. So fingers crossed that we have some good interactivity today. And I can see we're almost up to 50 now in the numbers, so that's fantastic. I'll maybe actually ask Sally. I mean, Sally, I don't know whether you're doing this yourself, but what words, couple of words that you might be putting in if you were answering this question yourselves, what kind of words do you think kind of capture the essence of the social value of housing?
Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what everyone else puts in. I think for me, I'd go back to what I said in the opening address. It's really, the word for me is hope. Social housing represents hope, and being able to hope for the future and have dreams for the future and have potential for the future. So that would be my word. Okay,
thanks a lot, and a really important word for to latch on to. Important to be optimistic at times like this, because it's so difficult to do that when everything seems so dark and difficult around us. Bent, how about you? What a word or two that you might key into this if you're not already doing that yourself?
No, no, I'm not already doing it, but one word, maybe 2 words. I think of equal opportunities in life and in education and on the labor market. Equal opportunities, it's very important for the individual, and it's very important for the society as a whole. So it's a kind of a link, I think, between the welfare of the individuals and the wealth of the society. So there is a link here between the well-being of the individual and also the long-term growth in the society. And also, I think there is a little bit of a link to the OECD. When OECD was born in 1960, one of the few things on the agenda there at the start, or one of the many things on the agenda in the start, was higher education to mobilize the intelligence reserve, as it was called back then. And it was working class children to get them better through the educational system, to better well-being for the individuals, and also higher growth of the industrial back then, the industrial societies back then, and higher welfare. So I think equal opportunities, that's what I think of.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bent. And that notion of housing as a foundation stone, as a keystone to everything. You know, if you don't have that security, then it's really hard to build other aspects of your life. It's so important to health and to people's economic well-being as well. So thanks for those key points. So that might give you some inspiration if you're adding words yourself. I can see that we're still involved in that. So as I said earlier, we'd be coming back to this. So don't worry if you haven't had a chance to contribute fully at the moment. During the breaks, we'll be popping the word cloud back up. And in the final panel session, when Bent and Sally and Sorka Edwards, who's the head of Housing Europe, will be joining us for a final wrap up, we'll have a look at this cloud and we'll maybe unpack some of those things together at the end of the morning. So thanks again so much for contributing. Thanks to Sally and Bent for that very positive start and for getting us up and running. We're going to shift our attention now across the channel to Paris. Delighted that Senor Angel Goria is able to join us, the Secretary General of the OECD. So nice to see you, Mr. Goria, and welcome.
Hello there.
And you know, I know how super busy you are just now, so we really appreciate you giving up time for this session today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, and the floor is yours.
Well, Monsieur Madsen, Madame Edwards, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'd like to thank Housing Europe for the invitation to this very timely event. Affordable and social housing is increasingly recognized as a key policy issue in Europe and indeed across the OECD. I'm therefore delighted to present today the OECD brief, Social Housing, a key part of past and future housing policies, which is made possible with the generous support of the European Union. Now, the toll of the COVID-19 crisis on the housing sector is not yet fully known. However, falling incomes may make the cost of housing prohibitive for many struggling families. The social housing sector can play a key role in charting a path out of the crisis. And it can be a crucial part of what we call now building back better. In this case, literally, because it's about housing. Today, social rental housing, often run by committed housing organizations and professionals such as yourselves, accounts for almost 30 million homes in the OECD. Now that's around 6% of the total housing stock. However, the sector looks very different from one place to the other. For example, in some OECD countries, social housing accounts for less than 2% of all housing. While in countries like Austria, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Scotland, the figure is over 20%. It's actually 10 times larger. Now, for decades, the social housing sector has provided shelter and housing security for low-income households. And this mission is as important now as it ever has been. In 2018, 1 in 3 low-income renters in the OECD, 1 in 3, spent over 40% of their disposable income on housing costs. Low-income households are also more likely to live in overcrowded conditions. Looking ahead, social housing can help us to achieve a more inclusive, more sustainable recovery. Let me briefly explain how. At the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, many governments acted swiftly to keep people in their homes, introducing emergency housing support, such as evictions bans or rent controls. These help short-term housing affordability for tenants, but could create disincentives to investments over the longer term and could be phased out once conditions move to a more normal pattern of events. Now, as social housing providers, you are in the front lines to ensure that tenants could cope financially with the crisis. These measures have helped to avoid the worst immediate impact of COVID-19. Yet, they are not the long-term structural solution that we need. To build back better, we need renewed investment in the housing stock. And this means reversing recent trends. Over the past 2 decades, and especially since the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, public investment in housing development dropped by more than half on average across the OECD. Dropped by more than half on average across the OECD, accounting for less than 0.1% of GDP in 2018. Over the past 10 years, the relative size of the social housing stock has actually shrunk in all but 6 OECD countries. During the same period, house prices have risen faster than incomes in 21 out of 33 OECD countries. The COVID-19 crisis has not created our current housing challenge, but it certainly amplified the gaps in housing quality, housing affordability, and housing stability. We can do better. For example, the experiences of Austria and Denmark, whose social housing stocks are among the largest in the OECD, demonstrate that revolving funds which ensure that social housing rents are reinvested in the sector can be one pillar of a long-term funding strategy for social housing. Investing in social housing also goes hand in hand with a more sustainable future. Coming out of the crisis, we have an opportunity and, let me say, a duty to develop a more environmentally sustainable housing stock. The building sector is responsible for nearly 30% of energy-related CO2 emissions in 2019. So the opportunities to green this sector, the building sector, are quite massive. Now, as part of the European Green Deal, the renovation wave is a call for action to improve housing quality, particularly the social housing stock. Many governments and social housing providers have already made this a priority. In France, for instance, the renovation of social housing is a key pillar of its national housing strategy. And the Slovak Republic's housing refurbishment program in recent decades has helped to improve both the technical quality and the energy efficiency of the housing stock. All this, in the case of the Slovak Republic, while generating significant savings for the households. So it's a kind of a win-win-win proposition. Now, at the same time, we need to ensure also that renovations don't become an excuse for renovictions, the displacement of low income and vulnerable households. So renovations, fine, but no renovictions. So, ladies and gentlemen, the OECD is committed to working with governments and stakeholders to develop better housing policies. Our ongoing horizontal housing project focuses on placing people's access to decent, affordable housing at the center by providing whole of government, actionable policy advice. We stand ready to support your efforts towards a more inclusive and sustainable housing future. Thank you and congratulations for your wonderful work. We stand by to support you.
Thank you very much, Senor Urias. Thank you so much for those solid, encouraging remarks. Thanks for reminding us that the pandemic has catalyzed many of the existing structural challenges we see in society. And I think for those of us who are involved in the social housing movement, it's in some ways heartening to hear that many organizations now acknowledge housing as being center stage in terms of how we move forward. I mean, for many years, Cinderella has always been like a Cinderella peripheral part of the conversation. And I think the fact that organizations like your own are so helpfully shining a light on housing and social housing is hugely, hugely important. I noticed your colleagues are sharing some of the policy briefings in the chat, which you won't be able to see because you're focusing your speech, but that's also really, really helpful. And one of the great things about these technological platforms, it enables us simultaneously to be recording, sharing these key documents. So again, that's really, really helpful. Thanks for making the connection to the European Green Deal, joining some of the policy dots in terms of the wider conversation. And also we'll be hearing later on about Housing 2030, which obviously the OECD is also instrumental and a key part of those wider conversations. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to your colleagues for all their work in the background in terms of making this happen. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with the OEC beyond our event today. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you very much. We're going to shift our focus now. We're going to move back to our conversation with the audience. We're going to go back to menti.com, in fact. And what we'd like to do, I guess, let me just pause for a second, because I guess one of the things that I've learned in the last sort of 6 months, and we've all had maybe a lifetime's experience crammed into the past 6 months, but one of them is in the past we'd have a conference for a whole day, and obviously we can't do that anymore. So today we've compressed things into a few hours. So we've probably taken a few things out we would have done in the past. We've still trying to get some space for interactivity, as we said. And we've also built in some breaks because we realize people's attention spans are limited and it doesn't do anyone's health any good to be staring at a screen all day. So shortly we're going to take a pause, a chance to get up, have a stretch, grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee. Before we do that though, a couple of things. So first of all, earlier on, we introduced the word cloud. We have 84 people in the word cloud during the break. The word cloud will still be there. But let's just shift our attention to a specific topic, which is after the break, we'll be having our first panel session. The panel session is really looking at this question of affordability and raising key questions which are part of the Housing 2030 conversation around what we really mean when we unpack some of these words like affordability. And we want to get some sense from you about what your thoughts are on these issues before we jump into this first panel session. So I'm going to ask my colleagues behind the scenes if we can just pop up the first question. Yeah, here we go. So this is your experiences. We're really keen to hear what you think about these questions we have for you. And the first one's a very personal question. It's talking about these strange months we've had since early March. Did you realize that something was missing? Was there something in your life or your home situation during the lockdown period that you really missed that could have made your situation more tolerable or more pleasant? So starting right at home, and we can see one of the nice things about Menti is we can see dynamically as people introduce their remarks, the visual changes on the screen. So it's about 50-50 at the moment. I'm going to let that run for a few more minutes and see what the final shape of it looks like before we go on to our next question. One of the things I was very conscious of in speaking to, continuing to work online with colleagues across Europe was, if you're, I mean, my kids are up and left home now, but if you're working from home with young children, juggling careers and homeschooling, and sometimes in an apartment with no outside space, it was incredibly stressful, really difficult for many people. So, I think we all understand that, our own individual circumstances are very, very diverse and very different, both across Europe and even within the cities and countries we live in. So let's just shift to the next question. It's about 60-40 there. So about 60% of you saying, yeah, there was something which could have made things better. I'm sure you can anticipate what the next question is going to be. The next question is going to be, what was that main thing that was missing? So if it's something you could have had in your own situation that might have made these difficult lockdown months and this ongoing pandemic period a little bit more tolerable, a bit easier, what would that thing have been? So more space, outside space, that might be a garden or a terrace or a balcony. Services, some of us are not so close to good services on our doorsteps. Sometimes we're all relying increasingly on being online, but that assumes we have equipment. It assumes we have high-speed broadband. So again, that's not the case in all these situations. And then a more fundamental thing is about heat and warmth. The first period of the pandemic coincided with pretty decent weather in many places. I think many of us are worried and anxious that as we go into winter and approach potentially, a second wave, which is now happening, the situation will be very different. So looking at this at the moment, again, it's a dynamic picture, and we've got about 50, almost 60 people responding. So space and outdoor space seem to be the key things that you're saying are really kind of important for you. And they're the things that you would have liked to have had. Let's jump into the next question. We've got a couple more of these, and then we're going to take a short break. And I know for our panelists, the next couple of questions will probably be helpful in terms of, helping them understand what's in your head and what sort of priorities you have. So in this one here, you're being asked to do a quiz. You'll see on your screen, if you're still on the Menti, that you'll be given a character. Some of these characters are on the screen at the moment. As you can see, we had quite good fun actually experimenting with this tool to see what all the different possibilities were. And you can see the wacky range of icons you've been given and the emojis you've been given. So we've got the first questions coming up. Okay, and here it is. So this is kind of on the serious business. We have a minute. So Eurofound who conduct regular surveys across Europe. In their most recent survey, what percentage of households said they may have to leave their home in the next 3 months because they can no longer afford their rent or their housing payments. What would you think that would be? And we might have to run this for a little bit longer. Let's just see how we get on. Okay, those are the options between 0.5 and 10%. So what proportion, what percentage of people think they might have to leave their home in the next 3 months because they are worried about the not being able to pay the rent? No Googling, someone just said on the chat. So, absolutely. Yeah, so we've got a few more minutes. Here's the countdown here, and then we'll see the answer. Time's up. Okay. Wow. So the bad news is that the real answer is 5%, so 1 in 20. That is a frightening number of people who are worried in the next 3 months, which is a very short term, that they will no longer be able to afford to cover their housing costs. That is a seriously worrying statistic. On a slightly positive note, half of you knew the correct answer. So I guess you're aware of how serious this is. And for me, when I saw the correct answer, when we were doing the background for this, I've been really shocked to see that statistic, because it's a really kind of worryingly high number. So that's the answer there. So well done, everyone. I think we have one final question to go. Yeah, here we are. And this final question links into our conversation about Housing 2030. It links into the next panel session. It's quite a long question. Apologies for that. So it's about different policy measures. So which do you think of these policy levers will have the biggest impact in terms of delivering sustainable quality homes to people who are in social housing situations? Okay, you have got the option of all of them. If you think there's something which is not on this list, then you can answer, you can put other, and you can tell us in the chat what that other is. So again, highly dynamic. We can see those barcodes shifting as people put their answers in. I'm going to give that a few more minutes to run, and then we'll freeze the frame and have a look at what you think. Okay, so at the moment, I'm just letting that run for a couple more minutes, and then we'll just push the pause button. Okay, so it looks like policy and planning around land, and we mentioned this whole thing, and I think Bent talked about, there's the whole sort of commodification of property and the value, and we talked about this last year actually in Lyon, when we had Saskia Sassen with us talking about this this kind of global turbocharged sort of challenge of stopping speculation around land and housing. Linked to that is funding. Many of you saw all of them, because clearly it's very difficult to choose one or the other. And then we have better regulation and environmental issues. So that's been really helpful for us to hear from you. We are about to take a short break until, if you're in the UK, 10 o'clock. If you're in mainland Europe, 11 o'clock. If you're in Finland, 12 o'clock. So you know what time it is where you are. So we've got about just less than 15 minutes. When we come back, we'll be jumping into our first panel session. We'll be showing a couple of short videos during the break. So if you want to watch those, then fantastic. If not, you can go and have a stretch. We will also be opening up a word cloud again. So don't forget to participate in that if you haven't already. Thanks so much to Ben, to Sally, so for Angel Correa for getting us off to such a positive start. Thanks to you for joining us. We'll take a short break, and we'll see you in a few minutes' time. Okay, thanks very much, everyone. So, hi everybody, welcome back. Hope you've managed to do a bit of yoga or step outside, get a bit of fresh air, or have a caffeine injection, whatever your thing is. So that was a really inspiring start, actually. And I have to say, it's so important to have organizations like OECD kind of putting their shoulders to the wheel in terms of what we're trying to do here. So thanks again to Angel Juria for joining us. And thanks to Bent and Sally for getting us off to such a good start. So we're going to kind of change the mood music a little bit. We've got a couple of panel sessions now coming up. As I said earlier, we're trying to make this as interactive as possible. And just one thing I noticed actually that we've got a Q&A bar and also a chat bar. And my colleagues are saying to me that people are putting their questions in the chat bar, not the Q&A bar. So, you know, it doesn't really matter that much. The only thing I'd say is if you put your question in the Q&A bar, you'll definitely get a response, because it's not going to get lost in the crowd of things. So either our speakers or we will pick it up. We'll either do that on the panel, or else we will type you an answer in the old-fashioned way. So if you want your question to get addressed, for sure, stick it in the Q&A bar and it will definitely get a response. Feel free to use the chat for other conversations, and it's great to see so many of you connecting with one another, and it's good to be part of this wider global community and the conversation that's going on. So let me just sort of set the scene a little bit for this first panel session. We have a fantastic lineup of participants. You can't see them on the stage, but you can see them hopefully on the screen on their cameras. I'll just run through who we have, and I'll tell you a little bit about how this is going to work. So we have Laurie McFarlane, who's joining us from Edinburgh. I think you're in Edinburgh today, Laurie. Laurie is the economics editor at Open Democracy. He's the author of Rethinking the Economics of Land and Economy. So he is an economist with some really kind of interesting, radical, fresh ideas about some of the things we need to be doing to make the kind of changes we've already been talking about. And then we also have Julie Lawson with us. Julie is the Honorary Associate Professor at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia. A very experienced housing and urban policy researcher. Julie is the lead writer for the Housing 2030 document, which most of you, I'm sure, are aware of. It's kind of seminal statement, which is in production at the moment, and we've had some sneak peeks at how that's going to look. And Julie will be lifting the lid a bit today on some of the key things that are inside that policy document. Julie's also the editor of the podcast Housing Journal, which some of you may be subscribers to. So Julie, it's great to have you with us today as well. We also have David Sim. David is a creative director at Gale Associates in Copenhagen, New York. Jan Gale's transformative ideas around people for cities, and the notion of making sure that people and spaces are at the heart of our urban design is obviously kind of game changing. And David is the author of Soft City, also someone who's been very influential in terms of the conversations we have about how we design and make our cities as livable as possible. So David, great to have you on the ticket this morning. We also have Larice Ponting joining us from Housemark. Housemark, if you don't know, is a really interesting organization which provides analysis, data solutions to the social housing sector. So it's a very niche operator. I think do some really, really interesting things. And again, many of you will be aware of the work that Housemark does. And then last but not least, we have Andrew Van Doorn, Chief Executive at HACT. A think and do tank, I think, is how the organization is described, Andrew. Again, doing some really interesting things around data standards, around social values. So again, we're really looking forward to your inputs. And what we wanted to do is we've actually asked our contributors, rather than a series of linear PowerPoints, to try and make this as interactive as possible. We're going to give Laurie the stage first of all, just to set the scene and to share some thoughts and maybe to send out some initial provocations for all of us. And then I'm going to ask each of the panelists in turn just to give us some initial reactions to Laurie's input. And then each of the panelists will have a few minutes each, just in a sense to go into a bit more detail about what their own priorities are in relation to this key question about affordability and quality housing. So it's rather a long introduction from me, so apologies for that. Anyway, but Laurie, great to see you. I can see you on the screen, and we've had a few chats in the past few days. Thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you with us. I'm going to mute my mic, hand over to you, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say to us this morning. Thanks a lot.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you to the organisers. It's a great honour to be invited to speak at this year's conference. It's also very sad on a personal level that you all couldn't be here in Scotland, albeit, as I'm sure is the case with many of you, things are far from normal at the moment, so it's probably not the best time to visit, but do come back and visit again sometime in future. Over the next sort of 10 minutes or so, I'm going to be drawing on some of the themes and findings of the book that Eddie just mentioned, which is called Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing. And shortly after we published that book, the Financial Times kindly reviewed it, and they said that Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing is a very appealing book, but it's not an appealing title. And they said it would sell many more copies if instead we called it This Is Why You Can't Afford to Buy a House, by which point, of course, it was far too late to do that. But I think that alternative title really gets to the heart of the question that prompted certainly us to write the book, and I know others who are researching this field, which is, why is it that despite the vast increases in wealth and the great advances in technology that we've had, one of our most basic needs, which is shelter, is for many of us a much bigger burden on our means than ever before? And that's what we're here today to discuss. So I wanted to begin just with a quote from a recent report from Savills, which is the estate agent. And the report said, we estimate that the value of all developed real estate in the world amounts to approximately $217 trillion. Real estate is the preeminent asset class. It comprises nearly 60% of the value of all global assets, including equities, bonds, and gold. And for me, in many ways, that statement is the mirror image. It's the other side of the coin, if you like, to the housing affordability crisis that we face across Europe and indeed across other parts of the world as well. And ever since land became private property all those centuries ago, it's really served two conflicting functions in our economy. On the one hand, it is a basic need that we all need for shelter, also for agriculture, for industry and other things. And from this perspective, it's desirable for land prices and rents to stay low to ensure that housing is affordable and to ensure that goods and services are cheap. On the other hand, though, it's from the very beginning, it's been intimately bound up with the evolution of finance, acting as a kind of asset upon which it's possible to secure credit, enjoy capital gains, and enjoy unearned economic rents. And from this ownership perspective, it's desirable for land prices and rents to be increasing rapidly. And so these two functions are in direct conflict with each other. And this is what we refer to in the book as the paradox of property. But today, this paradox is very much alive and well, and the primary way it manifests itself has been through the housing market. And in recent decades, land's exchange value as a financial asset has been very much prioritized over its use value as a basic need. And if we're to make any progress on this front at all, I think we need to start by recognizing that there is this fundamental contradiction between, on the one hand, the idea of providing affordable housing as a human right, and on the other hand, maintaining housing's role as a lucrative asset class, as a financial asset, and as a vehicle for accumulating wealth. This now begs the question then, what do we actually mean by affordable? We use that word a lot, and we often don't really talk about exactly what it means. There are various different traditional ways of measuring housing affordability, many of which rely on ratios, basically things like house price to income ratios, or how much people spend on housing as a proportion of incomes. And although this is what we commonly encounter, I think there are a number of problems with this approach. For one thing, they don't really capture the effect of housing costs on overall living standards. So you could have a high income household spend a relatively high proportion of their income on housing and still have plenty of money and resources left over to enjoy a very high standard of living. On the other hand, you could have a low income household that spends a lower proportion of their income on housing, but actually have very little left over in cash terms to spend on things, not only to survive, but to thrive. And so these kind of ratio approaches, they don't really tell us much about whether people can live good lives after their housing, after paying for the housing, which really ought to be our objective, I think. And in recent years, there's been some moves, there's been a lot of discussion about moving towards a kind of residual income approach to housing affordability. So capturing what people need to be able to afford after paying for housing. And the rationale for this is really that it's what people have left over after paying for housing that really matters most in terms of determining whether or not that housing is affordable. And my view is I think this is a much better approach. It doesn't come out without its challenges, namely how do we define what that sort of minimum acceptable residual income is. And here in the UK, at least, and I think in other countries as well, we have something called the minimum income standard, and this aims to identify what type of income households need to enjoy a socially acceptable standard of living, and it's based on what the public actually thinks is an acceptable standard of living, and it's updated regularly. And I think using something like this or something akin to that is a much better way to thinking about, well, what is that sort of minimum income standard of living after housing costs when we're thinking about housing affordability. But I mean, I'm very open to other ideas and look forward to hearing what the panel have to say on this. But what can we do then to make housing more affordable, however we define it? I think we can firstly be clear about what the answer isn't. And here in the UK and elsewhere too, there are efforts underway to blame the housing affordability crisis on the planning system or on regulations. And the UK government is in the process of trying to dismantle the planning system in England, strip power away from planning authorities and handing it over to unaccountable private developers. And I think this is based on quite a flawed misunderstanding about the roots of the affordability crisis. And if we allow this type of thinking to proceed, I think it will make the problems that we have much worse, not better. And as I already alluded to earlier, I think if we want to tackle the affordability issues that we face, we really need to move away from the idea that investing in housing can be a lucrative route to accumulating wealth. And to do this, we need measures to discourage land and housing from being treated as financial assets and to reduce the exposure of land and property to volatile market forces. And this is obviously no small task. There's no silver bullet solution. But I think there are 4 sort of buckets or key areas that we need to be prioritizing in our package of proposals. The first is on ownership models. As I'm sure most people at this conference know, we really need to be scaling up high quality, affordable, public, cooperative, community, or other forms of social housing that are designed to serve people and not profit. And I think we need to be guided here by a principle of private sufficiency, public luxury, because the reality is that we don't have enough physical or ecological space for everyone on the, everyone in the country or on the planet to enjoy a life of vast private luxury. But we do have enough space if land is used rationally for everyone to enjoy shared public luxury. So excellent parks and playgrounds, sports centres, swimming pools, public transport, etc. And so I think it's important when we're thinking about housing and the provision of high quality affordable housing, that this isn't pursued in isolation, but it's pursued in tandem with a more holistic plan for redesigning our communities around modern low carbon public transport links, high quality amenities, plentiful public space, and other shared resources. We also need to be looking at taxes and subsidies and using the tax system to limit the ability to make windfall gains and economic rents from housing and land, and capturing rising land values for public benefit. We also need to be scaling back subsidies that proactively incentivize speculative flows of investment into land and property, which are very harmful. We also need to be talking about financial reform. As I mentioned earlier, from the beginning, land and property has always been intimately bound up with the financial sector, and the liberalization of the financial sector in recent decades has been one of the key driving forces of the explosion we've seen in housing and land prices. And so we need to be looking at quite radical reforms to the financial sector to stem the flow of money and credit into property, which has the effect of just pumping up prices and destabilizing the market. And finally, I think we do need new approaches to planning and development. We do need to reform planning, certainly here in Scotland and in the UK, but I think we need more planning, not less. We often think of markets as some kind of mysterious and self-regulating forces that we can't really control. But in reality, markets are outcomes of the interaction between public, private, and third sector. And these outcomes can be created, shaped, and actively steered towards desired ends. And I think to flourish in the 21st century, we really need to be designing our built environment to serve human and ecological well-being. This means putting things like climate resilience, design and beauty, public health, and accessibility ahead of narrow profit motives and narrow economic growth objectives. And that means that planning authorities and other public authorities need to be granted the resources and powers that they need to plan strategically in the public interest, balancing social, environmental, and economic objectives. And I think that also means that local communities need to have a greater say democratically over the type of development that takes place. Land is always contested, and so I think we need new models of engagement and participation to make that happen. And importantly as well, the profit-driven speculative model of development, I think, needs to be replaced by a more public-led approach where we have democratically accountable bodies acting as the prime mover in land markets, making sure that land is brought forward where it's needed to serve the public interest and overseeing that strategic development. I think in many ways, we already live in a planned economy. The question I think we need to be asking is, who is it that should be doing the planning and in whose interest should they be doing that? I'll leave my remarks there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, David. I'm just doing the usual thing, making sure I'm not muted in these situations. Yeah, thanks. Lots and lots and lots of food for thought for us there. So stay with us and hopefully we can get you to jump back in. I'm going to bring the panelists in now, the other panelists in for some quick reactions initially, and then we'll go to each of the panelists just to say a little bit more about where they're coming from. And I should say to the panelists, I cannot see all of you on my screen. So if you want to jump in when things get a bit more interactive, on the participant list, you can see a little raise hand button. So if you pop that up, I should see you. So that way we can just try and keep track of the visuals and also the chat bar as we juggle these things. So lots of things there, David. And you finished kind of on this kind of key question of, what can we do, and set out 4 specific domains where we might actually pull some levers. I'm going to bring Julie in first of all, because Julie, you've got the Housing 2030 logo behind you. You're in the middle of grappling with these big tectonic issues. Just initially, a few reactions to what Laurie's just shared with us there before we come back to you for more detailed input.
I think there are a lot of really useful messages actually in what Laurie's been saying. Also the sense of the fact that we can actually shape markets ourselves. We've shaped them perhaps in the wrong way, and we need to sort of step back in and revise some of the key underlying mechanisms, if you like, land and finance being the 2 most obvious ones. So shaping markets rather than just mopping up market failure would be a kind of principle, or a new framing principle. So obviously social housing has a key role in that, but perhaps also broader in setting what good relationships around land policy, around circuits of investment should be, and not just seeing themselves as a small, if you like, band-aid, or a something that needs to treat the symptoms of a problem, but actually starting to look at what is generating the problem. One would actually say unaffordable housing is in effect a symptom of a dysfunctional housing system. So if we see it, as an outcome of something, then we need to get to the root of it. We need to know what's causing it. And Laurie's really put the pressure on the land question and circuits of investment. Where is money flowing? And of course, who's benefiting from that? And what are the implications? So that would be my takeaway. Thank you, Laurie.
Thanks, Julie. Great, and we'll come back to you shortly. Let's move to David. David's in Stockholm with Gail.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Davidson here, actually in Lund, in the south of Sweden. And just to explain, I'm a Scot as well. So although I'm representing Scandinavia here, I've kind of got two hats on maybe now. And I suppose first I was going to say congratulate Laurie on his very important book. What I've learned myself from branding the book, I had the working title, The Boring Shit That Works, kind of for what we do, but we branded that as Soft City. So something about branding there. I think, I don't know whether it is my Scottish hat or a kind of a frugal gene. I think the question of affordability is relevant for everyone. It's not just a social question related to poverty. There are choices about your life, how much you choose to spend, how much you choose to consume. And I think for me, this COVID period has had a couple of quite phenomenal paradoxes for me. The first one is, as everything has slowed down, we seem to have more time. And time to notice things, time to be with people, to be present in your family, in relationships, in place, in relation to the weather. There's a kind of this thing about slowing down gives you more time. And somehow by doing less, and I'd maybe quite an aggressive work lifestyle of traveling a lot, consuming a lot of travel and so on, somehow by doing less, you experience more. And I think this for me connects to a bigger question about living a simpler life, maybe a more wholesome life, living locally, consuming less, but actually living better. And I suppose one of the reasons I live in Sweden, in Lund, I commute 50 minutes to Copenhagen because I say my life may cost half what it would do if I was to live in very livable Copenhagen, but also very expensive Copenhagen. And also I live in a housing association. And I think the idea that someone who is educated with a professional job and a professional salary has that option of spending their money in a different way is important too. And I think that's something that surprised me. And I guess my family has done this kind of journey. My parents both grew up in council houses. Our family were the first generation to live in a private house. And now I've gone back to something possibly more affordable, because I think there's something about it. This question of cheap is not the same thing as affordable, and there's something about a bigger picture about what your life costs. So maybe we might come back to that, but the general question is, what do you want to spend on living? How much do you need to consume, and what quality of life that gives you? So these are some questions I'd like to maybe explore with the panel.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's brilliant. Yeah, this whole thing about non-stigmatized housing, it's a choice. It's not something which you only do if nothing else is, no other options are left to you. That whole sort of issue about how social housing is perceived in some parts of Europe, and maybe worth underlining, when you as a Scot living in Sweden but working in Denmark, the perspectives look very different depending on where you're sitting across Europe. Some of the language we use, tenants, residents, some of the lexicon varies, and some of these English words are sometimes unhelpful.
Yeah.
Because they're kind of international words, but they mean different things to different people. We might unpack some of that too. Thanks, David, for those initial sort of observations. We'll pick up on some of those shortly. And let's move to Larice at Housemark. Larice, I'm sure listening in intently to these conversations. Maybe a couple of things you picked up on from Laurie's initial opening comments there for us.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good morning, Eddie, and good morning, everybody. Really fascinating conversation so far, and I'm delighted to be part of this event. Yeah, really interesting points that both Laurie, Julie, and David have made. Sorry, David. For me, the kind of key points that come out is this fundamental point that Laurie kicked off with, which is the real kind of paradox between housing as shelter and a basic human right, and the need for all of us to build that, that safe, secure home. And as Sally said earlier on, provide, hope for ourselves and future generations. And the Savills report on, the investment class. Certainly in the UK, that is the most challenging paradox, I think. And I think the COVID crisis has brought into sharper focus than ever before, the people issues in relation to poor housing and this conflict that we've got between these two ends of the continuum. I think one of the key issues for me is, of those kind of 4 areas that Laurie mentioned, and indeed others that have mentioned, what are the key levers that we can pull? What dials can we turn up and turn down to actually drive decision making and behaviours? Because it's clear to everybody that we've got a complex interrelationship of finance, planning, regulation. What is it that really drives the decision making and the behaviours of housing providers? And on the one hand, we've got the kind of the core mission, the core purpose of housing providers in UK and across Europe. But certainly in the UK, we've got regulators who have got slightly different approaches to the compliance that they expect from registered providers. And very often we see that providers make decisions largely, although they may not always kind of want to admit this, but they do make decisions largely based on what the regulator requires them to, and therefore the government requires them to deliver on. So I'm not saying necessarily that regulation is the top priority. I actually think finance is, but they've got to come together. And for me, it's about focusing on the levers rather than trying to tackle everything, because I think that probably puts us on a road to nowhere, really.
Okay, thanks a lot, Larice, and thanks for kind of linking us to the question we asked our audience just before the break, where we asked them to pick out what they thought were the biggest challenges, and this whole thing about planning, the regulatory stuff, finance came up there, and I think you've reminded us, Laurie's main point about our analysis of the problem is complex, but we understand what the problem is. The bigger question is, what then do we do about it, and what levers do we have to try and tackle some of these complex systemic issues we see in front of us? Larice, we'll come back shortly to you to rejoin the discussion. Let's move to Andrew at Hacked. Andrew, you're sitting processing this. We're all taking this in from slightly different perspectives depending on where we sit and what we do. You're involved in an organization that's a think and do tank. You're doing research, you're influencing policy. Just maybe share with us a couple of things you picked up from Laurie's initial intervention, maybe some of the things that other panelists have linked into so far.
Indeed, thanks, Eddie, and I was really delighted to be here. And actually, the conversation so far is really, really good and rich. I think that, if I had a badge that said I agree with Laurie, then I would have that badge right now. I think actually a lot of what Laurie said is proposing other things we need to do. I think we have to be honest first of all, and actually say that we are living in an unaffordable housing crisis. We are living in a health crisis. We are living in a poverty crisis. And actually, we've got to ask the question is, what are we going to do? Because how can we allow this to continue? When you asked the question earlier on, what's about the percentage of people who are saying they're going to leave their home because they're unaffordable, if we look across Europe, that's basically the population of Poland. I think sometimes when we have statistics that says 5%, it doesn't feel much. And actually, when we have Savills statistics of $217 trillion, these figures just feel out of our minds. We can't quite conceptualize what this means. So for me, I always bring it down to the people and the people who live in our communities, in our societies, me, my friends, my families, my community. And actually, when we start looking at that and start thinking about people, I think we've got to be really concerned and we've got to start to act. There's too many vested interests who want to basically, and I'll put it this way, hoard wealth. And actually it's not working, and it's having a significant impact on the well-being of our communities. I think for me, well-being is the bit that I really think about and talk about. It's really good to see that kind of well-being as a public policy goal has come up and seems to be something that we are talking more about now. The OECD is talking more about well-being, we're talking about well-being, and we're seeing across the globe some really exciting ways in which governments and leadership is actually saying, if we put well-being at the heart of our economic discourse and our economic objectives, then actually we start to behave differently and we start to think differently. I can't sit here and be at all pleased around economic growth when I see increasing levels of homelessness, increasing levels of mental ill health, increasing levels of poverty, and increasing levels of distress. So therefore, our economic approaches are failing, and we've got to start focusing on what matters to people. So when we actually put that in the affordability box and ask, what does that mean for housing affordability? I also think things like income ratios just don't work. You could have a family living in a home which is affordable, but they could be overcrowding, having a huge impact on their mental well-being, having a huge impact on their educational attainment for the children, and more likely to be experiencing domestic violence. So we've got to start thinking about, how does the home facilitate an improvement and a recognition that well-being is an important part of our lives? And what does affordability therefore mean when we look through that lens? And for me, that is about the social value of housing. It's about understanding that well-being matters, and well-being should be what we are seeking to achieve.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. And I mean, thanks for just underlining the scale of the crisis and bringing it home, because you say these numbers are really hard for us to kind of to make sense of, whether it's the trillions of sables or whether it's percentages, and the kind of, I guess, immediate danger of what's around us is really important to underline, and also, I guess, the key thing around things will only get worse unless dramatic things change. And again, that comes back to Laurie's point about the four domains, the levers, and what we can do. Let me just remind the audience that if you want to jump into this conversation, you can do that on the Q&A bar with specific questions. You can do it in the chat bar. I know we've got one question so far. I'm going to go to Dara shortly and ask Dara maybe just to share some of those questions with us. But before we do that, I'm going to bring Julie back in, because the work that Julie is doing sort of joins some of the dots of these conversations and really is kind of central and links to what the OECD input said earlier on. So Julie, you're kind of in the hot seat in many ways, kind of pulling together this kind of key document for Housing 2030. I mean, it'd be really helpful for me, and I'm sure for many in the audience, just to hear a little bit more about what's in that package, maybe how it connects to what Laurie's done in terms of saying what we can do and what levers we have at our disposal. So Julie, over to you.
Yeah, happy to.
So you
Yeah.
just first, yeah.
Okay, I think in terms of the moment, the time that we're in, the next decade we've got to look forward to with 2030 approaching. We have to learn from past crisis and stimulus measures, and they have to be sufficiently large, timely, properly designed, and inclusive. We've been also told to build back better by the OECD. Social inclusion's on the agenda of Green New Deals. And of course, Housing Europe is really part of that renovation wave, but also warning, well, it needs to remain affordable. It needs to be, or still good quality, decent homes still need to be affordable. So Housing 2030 and all of this is about trying to put market shaping policies back on the agenda. We've had several decades of deregulation, and some of us suffer from policy and amnesia, and some public servants perhaps have forgotten how to govern, certainly not in Scotland, which in many ways is good practice and best practice even in the world. But with regards to, for example, land policies are key long-term instruments. Using your strategic plan, utilising lease contracts more effectively to set the direction of the desired development over many decades, being more proactive and adapting more assertively to needs given certain market conditions. In of this, of course, municipalities are crucial players often within a national legislative framework. They are key to land policy implementation, perhaps preparing local housing strategies. Their actions, of course, are delimited by what planning powers they have and what fiscal resources they have. So you do need agreements around the transfer of authority and resources to work more effectively. But we know that when has social housing, for example, been able to be developed in the past? And we need to look at what were the instruments. They include things like legislation to allow for compulsory acquisition and its fair compensation. When the public purchase of land, having a designated land banker in the game, an influential land banker, as in Vienna and other countries, also playing a part in providing direct equity into social housing developments. We know how vital that is in making projects feasible. That equity may simply be in the form of a silent loan, non-repayable loan, or an underlying lease, or a stake in a project. Also in designating particular areas like in a zoning plan, as it is in Vienna's step plan, which dedicates affordable sites for key worker housing and for making it possible and feasible, not inflating the price of what potential development could be. I mean, there are many other things, but what we're trying to do is sort of focus effort in particular areas on governing housing markets better, on access to the available land for affordable housing construction, but also in shaping those circuits of funding and financing to much better public purpose, and also importantly in this age, climate neutral housing construction and renovation. So we're doing that through a series, if I could just move forward, we have some whole series of workshops. We've got podcasts in the making. We have a 56 country survey, and of course a website where people can interact with and contribute to. The next major conference will be on climate neutral housing construction and renovation, of which Frans Timmermans will be the keynote speaker. He's of course, the leader of the Green Deal in Europe. We'll be focusing on housing governance and regulation towards promoting more affordable housing orientated developments. And that will be hosted by the government of Slovenia. We'll also be focusing on the all-important circuit of finance and funding, and that will be hosted by the government of Ireland in April. So our final draft, we hope, will be ready for everybody in June, and then eventually launched at UNEC, which is, of course, the 56 countries of Europe, from Vladivostok to Vancouver, a very large number of northern countries, in Geneva in October 2021. So it's very easy to get involved through those workshops, to contribute best practices, and to interact. We really encourage people also just to listen to those podcasts. They're good fun, and you can listen to them on the bus, and you can listen to them while you're doing cooking. It's also an easy way to learn and keep up with what other countries are doing, and it provides literally food for reform. So thank you.
Great. Thanks, Julie. But I'm going to jump to David shortly, but before you leave us, Julie, I see there's a question from Hélène Delacour, which is just saying, can you share with us some of the main factors and indicators which are successful in the UK in terms of promoting affordable housing? And you mentioned Scotland. And
yes.
Scotland, as somebody from Scotland, we're by no means perfect, and we have our own difficulties, as we all have. But as you say, there are some quite interesting things going on there. I mean, are there particular things that you would point to and say this is something which we should be doing in more places than simply one or two isolated examples?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way in which the housing demand need assessment informs local governments, who are therefore able to make appropriate housing strategies, working together with their planning departments, combining the effort with their housing departments, and together coming up with a strategy together, bringing the land questions and also the housing questions together, informed by some fairly dependable, nationally provided information. So well informed, well coordinated, and then of course resources. So making social housing investment plans together with those local housing strategies. Now, of course, being well coordinated and having the resources makes things far more efficient. So that is why the affordable housing program was able to succeed in Scotland like it has in few other countries, and also generate 50,000 dwellings, affordable dwellings, in a very short space of time. So we see, therefore, the dedicated land use planning, dedicated public investment with a purpose, and it's well-informed and coordinated policy making. And of course, working with the social landlords who are there with that mission, not to extract from the process, but to reinvest in the improvement of housing conditions, the quality of the housing, and so on. So a very well-regulated housing, social housing system, which also has tenants on the board, responds to and reports to on performance, also key issues concerning tenants as well. So at many levels, it's quite a good example that is emerged from Scotland. And it does differ from the productivity, if you like, the approach in England. It's been actually very, very effective. Yeah.
Thanks, Julie. Laurie, I can see you on the screen, so if you want to come in at any point, just give us a little signal and I'll bring you in. So I'm sure you're kind of listening intently. I'm sure you'll have things to come back on. Let's go back to David in Lund.
Hi.
David, I guess from your perspective, and Gale as an organisation which is known for, I say, this people-centered approach, and you have the value of being able to see things from a number of different angles, being a Scot living in living in Sweden but working in Denmark. Other things you'd want to contribute to this conversation about, maybe either around what things work well, or maybe this key question of why do things that work well, why do they seem difficult to transpose to other places?
Yeah, it's this hard balance of trying to listen and digest everything and to formulate a few thoughts. I think it's interesting. I mean, just to start, if that's a Scottish question, we're in a funny position in Scotland, being part of the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American world through English language and through the UK, while having a very strong European tradition. 50 years ago, the vast majority of people lived in rented accommodation, and living in a tenement was no means a social stigma thing. Far more varied social classes lived in the same areas, and we had a kind of more Central European tradition, although we were part of the UK. And I remember when my grandfather was faced with the question of whether he should buy his council house. Not even a moral dilemma, more of a why would I do that? Why do I need to? But it's already, it's not. It would be a bargain, but I already live in it. Why would I need to have this bargain? And I feel that Scotland's an interesting pivotal role about being a small country, part of a big country, because we see, in terms of delivering quality of life to their citizens, the smaller countries are performing really, really well. And traditionally there was the Nordic bloc, kind of Finland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, who are somehow ethnically just nice. But we're seeing now even an Anglo-Saxon historical country like New Zealand is actually proving a small country can perform incredibly well in delivering quality of life, security, from everything from whether it's been protected from COVID, the team of 5 million, to introducing living wage. So the small countries, and it's not because their people are better, just there's something about local democracy, local decision making being very significant. I think maybe Scotland sits on the balance here, being a small country next to a big country, and we can maybe see the pros and cons of those different systems. For me, a big thing was being shocked the first time I went to Germany and finding that doctors, lawyers, dentists lived in rented accommodation, which is also very interesting because in terms of bigger economic pictures. Economy is not just about property ownership. It's about the money swirling around in the economy and people having money left over for doing other things. And again, this is probably even true in Italy to a certain extent, that a middle class who doesn't own property can spend much more money, employ more local people, whether it's buying nice shirts, going to restaurants, having cups of coffee and haircuts. Far more significant local spend than the ones who are stuck with a very heavy mortgage. And there's an even worse, and if you add to that combination that most of these private houses, the private sector provided, are out with public transport, you've got the being weighted down by car ownership. And the fact that the car, I mean, so not only are you eating up all your money, but also all your time through this time transportation, being stuck in a car, affording a car, spending your money on a car, taking 3 years savings and giving all your money to Korea, taking that money out of the local economy. So again, I mean, I'm an architect, planner, so I'm looking at the physical side of things, the physical results from the very local, like, do different people live in the same place? Do our children play in the same parks? Do we sit together on the same bus, you know, listening to the same podcasts? I don't know, but do we, I would really like to say that I think we're living in an unaffordable world. And I think we've got to make this question of affordability relevant for everyone. Mm-hmm. And I always think it's really strange when we do this project, oh yeah, but there'll be 20% affordable housing. Yeah, does that mean there's 80% which is actually unaffordable? Yeah. Yeah. And somehow if we could make this affordability question relevant for everyone, and I think it will only be when better off people understand the advantages of living in a housing co-op. I mean, it's beginning to come with Baugemeinschaft, co-housing. Also in Melbourne now, they've got Nightingale coming, which is like a new way of thinking about ownership and tenure. And I think only when we bring a more cohesive society, when more of the movers and groovers, the decision makers, influential people live in housing cooperatives and live in social housing, they will push that agenda to the fore. And also will it become relevant? Because when you understand, when your money's not tied up in running 2 cars and paying a big mortgage, you can have a far greater quality of life, and your spend kind of a much positive income on your community. Okay. Was that a bit too much? Was that kind of tsunami of stuff? I don't know.
Thanks a lot. And it is really hard to, as I'm listening to you, I'm looking at the chat bar and just picking up on who we're going to bring in next year. There's lots of things in play here. I mean, your point about small countries where decisions are made, the kind of devolution of decision making, the kind of governance issues are interesting adjuncts to this conversation. I think also this whole sort of bigger conversation about choice and quality of life and you know, people having choices is, you know, in many cases people don't have choice. And I think just in terms of looking at the clock as well, we've got about just less than 15 minutes left to run. So I want to bring Laurie in right at the end of this, actually, maybe to give us some reflections on what he's hearing and just maybe to play back some of the key things that connect with how he opened up for us. I'm also going to suggest, and this is for our Housing Europe team, that either Dara or Diana come in just at the end too, because there's lots of things that go on in that chat bar conversation, which is super interesting, but we can't capture all of it. It's super rich. We will actually record, we'll create a snapshot of that, and we'll share it with a package of things that comes after this event. So nothing will get lost, nothing will end up on the floor. But let's keep going. I'll maybe let's bring Andrew in first of all, because I saw you nodding at various points, Andrew, when they were just speaking there, and then we'll go back to Larice, and then we'll go to Laurie. So Andrew, just maybe some further thoughts from you, either on what David's been picking up on or what we've heard from our other speakers so far.
I've got so many thoughts. This is a really interesting. I'll try and be brief and try and cover as many as I can. I think, first of all, I think the ideas of affordability being an issue for everybody is really important. I think the challenge of that, though, and particularly in the UK context, where actually the direction of travel, particularly for the UK government, that covers from a housing policy that's England, is that their approach to affordability is actually about home ownership, not about rental product. And therefore it's almost it's self-perpetuating. So we get ourselves into a track that says I need to accumulate asset wealth because my children don't have asset wealth, they can't get on this house into this housing ownership place, but they need to in the future. Therefore, by me accumulating wealth, I'll then pass that on to them at some point. And that's really pervasive. And actually, in some respects, the English housing policy is actually going in a really quite dangerous direction, because we're seeing issues around planning becoming, like reducing the requirements around investment in social housing. We're seeing actually issues around what we call permitted development, which is where we are seeing people, speculators going in, turning office buildings into homes and housing, usually poor, homeless families in massively overcrowded conditions. And I think this is a really dangerous direction, because we're just storing up more and more issues around mental ill health. We're not addressing homelessness properly. We're not looking for long-term solutions. And at the same time, some people are making a huge amount of money out of this. And I think that's really dangerous. I think the stuff that David was talking about the community wealth building, I think that's beginning to get some purchase in the UK. We're beginning to think about that. The role of social landlords as anchor organisations in place in it for the long term. Some housing associations in the UK have been here for over 100 years. And they're going to be here for another 100 years. So actually what we can then start to build in is a long-term perspective about how we make that change with some of the actors in the housing space, and how we start to work differently with each other. And I think my final thought, I'm just going to come back and just expand a little bit on the ideas about how do we build a social value well-being narrative into the affordability question. I do think we do need to start to unpack what does it mean to live successful lives in a home, and what does that look like, and how do we facilitate that? Because actually it isn't just the money that's left over at the end of the day for other things. Those other things matter as much as the home matters. So if you don't have access to affordable warmth, you don't have access to affordable internet, if you don't have access to be able to feed your family, to be able to participate in the community around you, if you're storing up issues around stress, anxiety, mental ill health, all of those things, if our home cannot facilitate that as part of the basics of who we are as humans and who we are as communities and society, then we are not addressing the affordability issue correctly. So we've got to shift our focus on that. It's not more than just an economic and price perspective. And finally, I think I'm going to leave you with an Oscar Wilde quote. I think Oscar Wilde did say that a cynic understands the price of everything and the value of nothing. And I think we are in a very cynical space.
Okay, thanks a lot. And you also used a very emotional word there, which is the word home, and this notion of home and a dwelling and something which is a safe space against the notion of a house and an asset, which is, a completely different kind of connotation. So thanks for those thoughts. And, I love my job, but one of the things I hate about my job is pushing this conversation through so quickly, because we could easily just sort of push the pause button and spend the rest of the day talking about this, but sadly we're going to have to kind of move on. And let me bring Larice in for some maybe final thoughts from you, Larice, on, again, lots of things pinging around here. Maybe just pick out one or two which are really kind of sticking with you at the moment.
Well, I think lots of things, so much to say. I would want to draw out two things. In our role as the UK sector's data expert, we've collected performance, cost, socioeconomic data over a 20-year period to help providers make policy decisions and to make decisions. In the last 7 months, we've seen firsthand the impact of the COVID crisis. And the most obvious one is on increasing arrears and the impact on providers' ability to collect income. Now, that's got two implications. One is obviously the human cost of that, and the points that Andrew made earlier on in terms of, the crisis of well-being, the crisis of health, the crisis of housing, and so on. I think the second area is that in the way that, particularly England, as Julie said, in the way that the English government looks at housing providers, particularly housing associations, it's about accessing their balance sheets to deliver new supply. And of course, accessing balance sheets to deliver new supply requires housing associations to, access funding, particularly rents, but capital grants that they then have to pay back. The sector is facing a number of challenges that are being exacerbated by the human impact of COVID, and those are investment in stock that's 70 plus years old, the zero carbon agenda, we've had a big issue around building safety from the Grenfell fire. So housing providers are looking at a number of challenging situations and demands on their finances. Looking at that in a optimistic way, maybe this is the point that this level of almost kind of perfect storm where, you know, the regulators might talk about trade-off decisions for boards to make, but the reality is, you know, none of these things can be done properly. So the optimistic point, and I would really welcome, you know, Laura's views on this. The optimistic point is, can we use this opportunity to really bring home the fact that we've got this perfect storm? We have to use a different kind of funding arrangement, maybe flex the regulation in order to shift focus of governments onto investing more effectively in social housing. The final point that I would make is around affordability. Laurie mentioned earlier on about minimum income standard. Housemark has worked with the SFHA to build on their affordability guidance, and we have developed an affordability tool which allows comparisons between proposed weekly rents around 5 affordability measures. Now, it is quite an operational issue, but it does help organisations to get some insight into the balance between rent levels and affordability for tenants. So I'll stop there because I'm very conscious of the time. Could speak a lot longer, and it's been such a privilege to join this panel and conference today. Thank you so much.
Louise, that's brilliant, and thanks for teeing up some of those questions for Laurie, and thanks also for just kind of stating something which is very obvious but really important, that, you know, there is a chance for a reset. This is like, I mean, I think David mentioned this, the whole slowing down thing in this moment of reflection and this opportunity. And I guess we had that during the global financial crisis at the end of the previous decade, and clearly that was an opportunity missed. You know, we don't want this opportunity also to be missed. So again, I'll be keen to hear Laurie's thoughts on, you know, the extent to which this can be a moment to reset. Before we go to Laurie for some final comments, I'm going to bring Dara Turnbull in. Dara's been keeping an eye on the chat, and the chat is kind of blistering. I don't know if you've got the chat open, but there's a huge amount of stuff going on there. Really, really interesting content. Lots of references, lots of discussion, lots of things which tie into what we've been seeing on the screen. Dara, I'm not going to ask you to summarize everything, because there's way too much going on there to capture it, but maybe a couple of thoughts on what's in there that's really kind of jumping out for you.
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. As you say, the conversation is really jumping kind of all over the place. There's a lot of activity on the chat and on the Q&A, so I'll try and just bring in maybe 2 or 3 of the main things that I've seen. So firstly, the director of Fiance, the homeless network in Brussels here, Frank, he was very curious for our upcoming event on the November 10th, because in his view, Executive Vice President Timmermans has struggled to outline at this point how the renovation wave will be affordable for low-income families. That's something that's really important that hopefully we'll get answers to at that event. Doris Andoni, who's coming from the Albanian context, is wondering, how do we communicate to people in countries without strong social housing systems the benefits of social housing, and how do we get countries like Albania to actively engage in the provision of social housing? So that's a really important thing, and hopefully Housing 2030 will be part of changing the conversation in those countries. And I know Julie and her colleagues are really working towards that goal. And then finally, one point we had here from Corna Coppola, who is basically wondering, where does the responsibility of public agencies stop, and where does the responsibility of private agencies begin? So where is that kind of divide between public and private in terms of the housing market or the housing sector? So they're kind of 3 of the main points. And also finally, I'd like to thank Marissa from the OECD, who I see is on the chat, engaging with people and outlining the position of the OECD. So it's great to have you still with us, Marissa. Thank you very much.
Great stuff. Thanks a lot, Dara. Brilliant. Really, really brilliantly summarized. So, Laurie, back to you, just to, again, I'm just going to click my mouse so I can see you on the screen. Yeah, so just, I could see you nodding, reacting as you were hearing some of the stuff, lots of things in play. Can you just share with us maybe some final closing points, just as we wrap up this, I mean, really rich discussion this morning? What are the key things coming out of this for you, please?
Yeah, thanks very much. Lots and lots of things, lots of great points and great discussion. What I think I wanted to do to conclude is maybe to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about, well, what are the barriers and opportunities to getting where we want to get to, and how can we leverage this moment to make change? And it touches on a number of the points that were raised. I mean, Andrew talked, I think, about, I mentioned vested interests, and Doris, I think, asked in the Q&A about, well, how do we get governments interested in doing things like social housing? And this undermines what I think is the key problem, because although we like to think that this is a kind of a technical problem, and we think, well, what are the technical solutions? And that's an important discussion. The main barrier I think that we're grappling with is actually political. And for that reason, we need to get our hands dirty and think about political economy here, because there are lots of vested interests who benefit immensely from the status quo of a highly financialized land and housing economy, who will resist efforts to transform it. And the challenge is huge, because it's not just things like developers. We also have the problem, certainly in the UK and other countries, where in terms of the banking system, most bank balance sheets are secured against property values in this country. And if property values fall in any significant way, you risk triggering a banking financial crisis. But most significant of all, I think, is actually ordinary homeowners. There are in countries where home ownership is in the majority, that they're benefiting tremendously from the status quo. And over time, the number of people with a vested interest in a highly financialized housing market has grown. And the number of people with a vested interest in, for example, having high quality public or social housing has declined markedly. And for the majority of the population, at least here in Scotland and the UK, the family home now is the primary source of wealth. That is the main source of wealth. And will politicians act in a way which might be seen to be at odds with the interests of the wealth of the majority? And so we find ourselves in a kind of a bind, which is that many of the policies that we're talking about here, which are, I think, necessary and essential, aimed at addressing the affordability crisis, risks, to some extent, generating, on the one hand, an electoral backlash, because it might not be the interests of the majority who are benefiting from this, but also, if you're not careful about how you do it, risks generating financial instability and possibly economic downturn, given how intertwined our wider economy and property systems have become. And so for me, the greatest challenge that we need to think about is, how do we not just what do we need to do, but how do we transition to where we need to get to any sort of planned, coordinated way, not a chaotic way, that can carry broad public support in a way, as I say, that doesn't cause economic chaos in the process. And that's a much more difficult question than just what do we need to do. And so I don't think there's an easy answer to that at all, but I think we all need to be sort of thinking about that when we're going about our work on this stuff, because if we can't do that, then we're not going to make progress here. So yeah, that's just what I thought I would end on. Not the most optimistic, but I think it can be done. I just think we need to be thinking very carefully and long term about how we do it.
Okay, Laurie, thanks so much. Thanks for just closing by saying this is about political choices. We can get stuck in the weeds of the technical stuff, but there are high-level political choices which are really central to this discussion. That was a brilliant exchange. Thanks so much for all of our contributors, both on the panel and also on the chat. So I've really, really enjoyed that. I'm sorry I have to cut it off now. If you want to tell people who are not lucky enough to be here what's happening, you can do that through Twitter using the hashtag #NoPriceTag. You can carry on with the chat. We are about to take a 10-minute break. We will be opening up the word cloud again, so don't forget to go on Menti. If you didn't put in some of your choices, you can do that now. We're also rolling a couple of videos just to tee up our second panel discussion of equally brilliant contributors. So we'll be focusing there on questions of transition and how we involve tenants and residents in decision making. Thanks again to all of our panelists. That was fantastic. Have a short break, guys, and we'll see you in 10 minutes time. Okay, thanks very much.
Over the years, Easter House has seen a great deal of change, but one thing that hasn't changed is its sense of community. When residents of Easter House were experiencing difficult times and housing conditions were at an all-time low, they took action and fought to build their community. They believed that everyone has the right to a quality and affordable home, that everyone has the right to receive support and advice when they need it, and that everyone has the right to have a say about how their community is shaped. This is the story of how community-led housing has helped to transform Easter House into the thriving.
Sharing is paused because you shared window to the front. Thanks.
Of Easter House were experiencing difficult times and housing conditions were at an all-time low, they took action and fought to build their community. They believed that everyone has the right to a quality and affordable home, that everyone has the right to receive support and advice when they need it, and that everyone has the right to have a say about how their community is shaped. This is the story of how community-led housing has helped to transform Easter House into the thriving community we see today.
Well, before the housing associations took over, the houses were in a terrible condition, dampness, and the environment outside the houses was pretty bad.
The majority of houses were derelict, boarded up. There was no green areas, there was no play areas, there was graffiti everywhere.
We were fed up living in houses that weren't fit to be lived in. Our children were constantly sick, constantly had colds, and we were getting no repairs done.
That was the motivation for getting involved, to change that, then to live in a community where my kids could grow up, where I felt they were safe. Back then we were looking to get the houses refurbished. The aim was to do what we could with what we had at the time. The majority of the cases, that was refurbishment. The houses were new windows, central heating, new bathrooms, new kitchens. Could never have took that jump to now where the majority of tenants are living in new build homes. It's not something we could envisage. Couldn't imagine ever getting there.
I've seen it changing from like not having anything until I've been like spring parks and it being a nice area to live in, and now like lots of people want to live there. The waiting list is amazing, and maybe 30 years ago that wouldn't have been the case. People were trying to move out of the East End and now people are wanting back to the East End because housing associations have made it a lot better place to be.
It's vital for the community and the tenants to have that more of a proudness to their area and not to be ashamed to say I come from Easter House.
As a housing association, we listen. We look at the needs within the community. What do people need? What size homes do they need? Everybody is listened to, and as much as we can, we provide for the different needs.
Some of the housing associations have their own community centres. where they run classes, they run nurseries, adult learning centres, groups for people with all sorts of disabilities.
I've been coming to the youth club for around about 5 or 6 years, and right now we're making a fire and we're going to be cooking pizza on it. I enjoy it because it gives me some time to play with my friends.
I feel more relaxed and like I've met the friends that I've never met before, and like trying activities that they've never tried before and that.
When I saw my job advertised as well, I thought, I know, I used to leave the house and think that the place was a bit of a mess and I can fix that myself now. I think any opportunity at all that can come up to help your community or help your neighbour, you should take it.
We're all born the same wherever you go, so I don't see why people shouldn't have a roof over their head and a bed to stay warm in at night rather than worrying about if they've got enough room or if the house is adequate enough for them. Everybody should have the same opportunities.
Having 4 people in a 2-bedroom flat just didn't fit, it wasn't right. Now I've been offered this. It'll make a massive difference to my life because it's more relaxed because of the amount of space we've got. It feels as if I've won the lottery or something. It's amazing.
It was excellent today to see so many young people coming along because we need their energy. We need to listen to them and learn from them, and hopefully they can listen and learn from us as well.
The future's theirs and the community's future belongs to them. The history and their heritage belong to them as well, and it's there to be kept and it's there to grow.
Well, welcome back, everybody. Hope you managed to have a bit of a stretch and managed to move around a wee bit during that short break. Thanks for that fantastic, inspiring video from Era. And we've got on our second panel, in fact, Linda Cameron will be with us, who's the chair of the Easter House Housing Regeneration area. So she'll be joined by Craig Vasey, who's from the Wheatley Group, also one of the big housing providers in west coast of Scotland. We've got Joanna Brzezinska joining us from the city of Łódź in Poland, and great to have you with us, Joanna. We also have Flemming Leuvenhout joining us from the Danish Federation of Social Housing Providers in Denmark. And last but not least, we have Raphael Damercourt joining as Director of Urban and Territorial Affairs, joining us from the Union of Social pour l'Habitat in Paris, in France. So a nice geographical mix. We'll be talking about transformation. We'll be talking about tackling some of the misperceptions of social housing. We'll be talking about how we put decision making in the hands of tenants and residents. So that's going to be our theme for this second panel session. Really looking forward to it. And thanks again to our panelists from the earlier conversation, because it got us off to a fantastic start. Before we go to our panelists, let's go back out to our audience. Let's go back to our menti.com platform to hear the thoughts of people who are in the room around a couple of the key questions that we're going to be talking about on this second panel today. Can we just pop the screen up with the Menti information so that people can have a look at the code and also the question we have for them? Here it comes now. So here we go. This is still from the last session. So we can still see the code is still the same at the top, 817778. And if you're just joining us, then it's menti.com on a smartphone or whatever device you're using. So we've got a couple of questions just to try and get an understanding of the audience perspective on some of the things we're going to be talking about. This first one is about, I guess it recognizes the different situations we were all in across Europe, globally, in fact, and we've already talked about that in these discussions today. So in your own situation, would you say you have a strong history of community-led housing initiatives? Is that something which is an established way of doing things? Would you say, on the other hand, that this is a newer thing and we see some new developments, but it's still quite kind of new and maybe embryonic? Or would you say that there are not so many, and that's partly because there is limited scope to support them? That might be financial, it might be the skills people have. We'll come on to talk about what are the barriers at the moment. So again, just to get a sense of where our audience is. As you can see, Diana, who's been with us, has been experimenting with every possible way of using menti.com. So this time we're having little clusters of dots instead of a bar graph to show what people think. We've still got lots of dots jumping in, so it's a bit like putting sticky notes on a wall, isn't it? So at the moment, it looks as though the one on the right is the most common situation where this is not so popular. It's not so so common, and then there are some barriers to enabling community-led approaches, which we might come on to talk about in our panel session. We've only got 23 people who have contributed so far, so I'm just going to give that a little bit more time, because I know we've got about 100 people on in our virtual room at the moment. So let's just give you a little bit more time to have a think about that. Okay, so a little bit, we've got almost a third of people saying there's a strong history of this. So again, we're going to hear shortly from some places where this is a a well-established way of doing things, and it'd be good to also to hear what some of the issues are, and why are we not doing more of this? In the previous panel, we talked about why do we not replicate things that work well? Why is it sometimes difficult to transfer them from one place to another? And again, we might talk about that in this discussion that's coming up. Okay, so I'm going to just draw a line under that. You see almost half, here's a big other cluster coming in, almost half of you are saying there have been a few, but there's limited scope to support them. So I think on balance, that probably suggests that there's a few structural issues which are getting in the way of this way of working, and we might come back to talk about them in our discussion shortly. Let's jump to the second question. Second question really picks up on this 49%. This is about, so what's the problem? So if we're talking about community-led housing and we're talking about putting residents and tenants in the driving seat and helping them make decisions and be in control, and we talked in the first session about how we take decisions down to the right kind of levels, what's getting in the way? You can see, I'll just read through the options while you're thinking about them. So no demand. So do we think there's limited demand? All the options are now gone, I can't see them. I think one of the other ones was about skills and capacity. Another one there is about financial inflexibility. So just the complexity. We've already talked quite a bit about finance already this morning, so that's a factor. Lack of commitment from public authorities. There's a kind of a sort of devolution stops here kind of conversation where people are happy to have it stop at their organization and then not go below that. There's a fear that what will people do if we give them the powers to make decisions? So there's a number of attitudinal things we might want to pick up. So we've got a nice, again, a different way of showing the information. I think it's nice to mix these things up. So we've got a pie chart this time. We've got about 50% saying it's the biggest barrier is lack of commitment. We've already talked about political will this morning, so I guess that's a factor. After that, we've got the financial stuff. Skills is also in there. Interestingly, no demand from neighborhoods is the smallest slice of the pie, which I have to say personally, I'm not surprised to see that, but it's good to see that. It's good to see that's an issue. So let's let that run for a little bit longer, because again, we've got more of you who are on the call who haven't voted, haven't shared your thoughts yet. So I'll let that run for a little bit longer before we bring our first panelists in. We also talked yesterday about when we are looking at this, should we play music or should I just talk and fill the space? So it all sounds a bit funny when you say nothing and there's a kind of wall of silence. So I'll just keep kind of chattering away while this is just slowing down and finalizing. Okay, so I think that's probably helpful for our panelists, Sure, Fleming and Craig and Joe. and Linda and Raphael are looking at this with interest, and I'm sure you may have things to say about this. It might reflect your own situation. It might be quite different, so we might pick up on that in the conversations. Again, we've tried to keep this as fluid as possible. We've just asked our panelists to share a couple of images, which give you a sense of how their local situation looks and gives you a sense of what the journey has been in terms of transformation. So let's start at home for me anyway. Let's start in Glasgow. Let's ask Craig Vasey to join us. Craig, you're with the Waitley Group, which is the biggest, I think the biggest housing association in Glasgow, in the west of Scotland. Thanks for jumping in at short notice. I know you're replacing a colleague who is due to be with us today. Great to see you. The floor is yours, and I think you're going to share a couple of images and just say a bit more about that transformative journey that we've heard a little bit about from the video we saw earlier.
Yeah, thanks for having me here, and it's been an interesting discussion. So hopefully some of the things that I'll talk about will also reflect the previous session as well. So just to put into a bit of context, the Waitley Group is the largest housing association in Scotland. We have about 93,000 properties, which is a huge scale for Scotland, which is more community based. And for the last 4 years running, we've also been the largest developer of social housing in the UK. I thought I'd focus on a particular part of our development programme today in terms of our regeneration initiative in Glasgow. And we have a partnership company that was established with the Scottish Government and Glasgow City Council called Transforming Communities Glasgow. And that really focuses in on 8 areas of the city where there was a need for comprehensive regeneration. So it's important that we establish that to get the political will together, the strategic elements, and also to be able to access the right support from the communities there. So the partnership company has a board, and it also has officers, including myself, who work on the regeneration initiative. Each area is obviously unique to its own set of circumstances and context. And the image I've showed here is of Sighthill, which is the largest of those regeneration areas. It was formerly one of the biggest chemical factories in the world. And then in the 1960s, it was redeveloped for social housing. And the tower blocks that you can see on the image there, those houses were of poor quality, they were of inappropriate standard and poor connection to the rest of the city, and the groundworks were never completed properly, so the land remained contaminated. So Sighthill is one of the most transformative in a kind of physical sense of the regeneration areas, and the photo you can see now is the first social housing that was developed as the first phase to rehouse tenants who still lived in the area. And then you can see some of the master plan images as well in terms of the 840 houses that will be built on the site, and some of the infrastructure projects as well, connecting over the motorway and parklands, etc. But one of the key things about Transforming Communities Glasgow is the community-led regeneration approach. So each area has what we call a local delivery group established from the outset. And that includes the 3 partners, so including Waitley Group, but it also includes the local councillors for the area. It includes if there's a local housing association working in the area, or any community groups that may already be established there. It includes the chair of the local tenants organisation and any other kind of community actors that work there. And that is a 2-way process then, where all projects and programmes within those areas are discussed in this forum. It's a tool for the board of TCG to communicate what is going on in these areas and what the proposals might be. And it's also a way then for the community and the local delivery group to report back to the board about the aspirations, about what they would like to see happen in this area, and help drive those decisions, shape what is happening. So in some areas, there are also then strategy groups developed up the back of that. At the moment, a lot of that is around open space. So in Sighthill, there's community involvement in terms of the design of new parks, of the bandstand, there's community open days. In other areas like North Torrey Glen, we've seen these groups leverage in funding, so a local charity who manages woodland areas work with a regeneration agency and a partnership to leverage in £2.6 million to look at the green space for the area more widely and encourage active travel. So that kind of community-led approach is central to our regeneration programme. The way that Sighthill has also been developed, delivering affordable housing first, so across the 8 areas, To date, 2,500 social homes have been delivered. Mid-market rent has also introduced, that's an affordable tenure in Scotland, has also introduced a bit of tenure diversification. And there's around about 1,000 private sector homes for sale, are either started or have been sold already. But the focus very much on communities in place. So at Sighthill, the new community campus opened ahead of any private sector development, providing new school, training opportunities, pharmacy, etc., alongside then infrastructure and community facilities. So the context of a community is already there from the outset, and it's not that we've just swept away what was previously there either. And then that also encourages the kind of quality of development for the private sector, and then encourages a better land receipt to fund some of this partnership activity. We also have a commercial part of our organisation, which does property management and factoring, alongside some mid-market rent portfolio. And that makes a charitable donation. It doesn't make profit. It makes a charitable donation back to the Wheatley Group and our work in the Wheatley Foundation, which provides services to around 12,000 households across Scotland. So issues of fuel poverty, other aspects of poverty, education, we provide bursaries. During the coronavirus pandemic, we've delivered 15,000 food parcels across Scotland to those in need. So it funds that type of activity as well.
Thanks a lot, Craig. Thanks a lot for that kind of introduction, that overview. We'll come back later on and ask you, because the audience said that the biggest barrier to devolving decision making involving community-led approaches is this lack of public sector appetite, this lack of policy commitment. And it sounds from your perspective as if maybe that isn't the biggest factor, that things are never perfect, but maybe that's not the biggest issue. But let's come back to that shortly, because I just want to keep moving around the table to get it started. Let's go from the west of Scotland to Eastern Europe. Let's go to Poland. Let's bring in Joe Brzezinska. Joe, hi,
hello.
Great to see you here.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Do you hear me well?
Yeah, we can hear you really clearly.
Great.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you for having me and inviting me to take part in this panel. Yes, my name is Joanna and I work for the municipality of Łódź in Poland in Revitalization and Housing Bureau. And today I would like to share with you some of the experience from cooperation with our residents and solutions we implemented for the sake of people living in a degraded area located in the very heart of my hometown. And everything started in 2015 when we developed a municipal revitalization program. As it was mentioned in Scotland, yeah, we have maybe not similar, but also a large format urban regeneration program. And basically based on statistical data, we delimited a degraded area where numerous negative phenomena occur, primarily in the social sphere, but also in the economic, environmental, spatial, material, and technical spheres. And it turned out that concentration of problems in these spheres is observed in the historic city centre, where majority of our municipal housing stock is located. You should know that Łódź is the biggest landlord in Poland, and that we still own more than 43,000 flats, which are mostly located in old, run-down townhouses from late 19th and early 20th centuries. This means that still a significant number of these flats, houses, are not connected to central heating or municipal water and sewage systems. And people living in these communal flats are often from difficult social background. So these are rather low-income groups who cannot afford to own or nor rent a flat on the market. And in order to prevent this trend, in 2016, we started a complex and comprehensive process of revitalization, including renovation and retrofitting of tens of these townhouses. And to support residents who are affected by this process, we developed and implemented various solutions. And today, if I will manage with my time slot, I would like to tell you about 5 of them. And these are work of our mediators, Uecd Group, microgrants, multi-generational house, and model of settlement. So in order to carry out revitalization on such a large scale, we had to plan and organize relocation of almost 1,000 families if I remember correctly, it's 996, to another location for the time of retrofitting of their townhouse. So to facilitate this process and help these residents, we hired people who became unordinary, extraordinary city officers, not working from behind the desk. They serve as kind of liaisons between the municipality and residents, and we call them area hosts and lighthouse keepers. Area hosts are responsible for providing up-to-date information on planned revitalization activities, as well as foreseen relocation schedules, while lighthouse keepers help residents directly in the process of relocation and provide them comprehensive support in solving daily problems. For example, they encourage them to join debt arrangement schemes, as many of these people simply have problems with paying off their rent arrears. And together as kind of mediators, as I said, they have managed to improve communication between the city administration and inhabitants, and build, I would say, greater trust in activities that we carry out. And building up on this good practice, we joined an urban transfer network, a project called Urban Regeneration Mix, which I have the pleasure to coordinate, in which not only we share what we learned through our mediators' work, but also draw from experience of other 6 European cities that are with us in this network, who apply people-based approach and area-based approach to their urban regeneration activities. In the beginning of the project, we set up an urban local group, which serves as a forum for people living in one neighborhood on a revitalization area. And on one of the pictures that were shared, you could see a meeting of this group. This group is basically formed by city officers, including an area host and a lighthouse keeper, but first and foremost, residents, local activists, entrepreneurs, and representatives of schools, NGOs, and religious institutions that operate in the same neighborhood. And prior to establishing the ULG, they didn't know each other. So we meet on a regular basis every month or so. Pandemic compounded our initial plans a bit here. And our role here is to be community connectors, animators, as we want to bring these people together, help them to meet and initiate joint activities for the benefit of the whole community. And on one of the photos that were shared, you could see an image of people having workshops together, animation activities, because that's what we do also. But our activities also deal with intervention of a physical character. We helped such a local community to apply for a micro grant to repaint and beautify a yard within a townhouse they live in, because you need to know that majority of townhouses have a yard in the back of the front building. And more often than not, they are grey, dull and dirty. And this is the place where much of the social life goes on and where children spend their free time after school. So on this photo, you can see that an example of such a microgrant activity that was financed within the program. Quite a few local communities took advantage of it. It was called Between Us Neighbours. And the aim of this program was to support neighborhood initiatives of residents in the revitalization area. And when the first call was announced, I think that around 93 applications were submitted and 43 of them were implemented. All of them were in line with our revitalization activities located on the area and encouraging cooperation between residents in the neighborhood. And grants ranged from 1,500 PLN to 5,000 PLN, which is about between 200 and 1,200 euros. The ideas included organizing a neighborhood fest, creating a herbal garden, or our arts and crafts workshop. But mainly, as you saw, people wanted to make a quality change of their local yard where they spend their time. And another interesting solution we implemented, I would like to share with you, is creating a multi-generational house. It is an idea that we implemented based on a model developed within an EU-funded project. We basically changed a revitalized, historic, and listed townhouse, which was renovated with municipal money, into a diversified housing community, because this house was resettled on the basis of social mix rules in order to prevent gentrification, of course. The model of a multi-generational house assumes active interaction between its residents of the house, and the nearest neighborhood, for the benefit both of them and other tenants and the neighbors and the people living in the nearest neighborhood. Support for the house is provided by the operator of a neighborhood club. It is a common space there where integration and animation activities are conducted, and basically it stimulates the creation of neighborhood community. It is a space engaging local community members, among others, to participate in grassroots initiatives proposed by residents, volunteering, contributing to neighborly help. And by creating this model for functioning of a multi-generational house in accordance with our model of settlement, we conducted focus group interviews with people representing different social groups, which were selected for the social mix, meaning elderly people, people with disabilities, families with children, young people. At that stage, we asked them about their expectation regarding the principles of cooperation within such a house and the way the neighborhood club should function. As a result, 16 flats which are there were resettled in accordance with our model of resettlement by people from different age groups, social groups, and level of independence. There is, for instance, a senior using a wheelchair. There is a widower who used to live in a huge house, a huge flat he could not afford after his wife passed away. And there are about 3 or 4 young families with children. Some of them, the parents, moved there from an orphanage because we have former foster pupils there as well. And I can't say that all is fine and that they live happily ever after. After almost 1.5 years, there are some conflicts between them. Between some residents, but we are trying to solve them with the help of our mediators and an NGO that operates the neighborhood club. So I hope I managed to use my time and give you an idea of what we deal with in Łódź, but let's say the whole urban regeneration scheme that we are running is not focused on the physical revitalization, which is the core of it, of course, but it is mainly for the people and with them. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Joanna. And we showed your video actually during the break, and I think that was also a nice way to see an individual person's story of what's been happening. As you say, it's about people much more than about the physical stuff. And a couple of things you mentioned that we'll maybe come back to. One is you didn't use the word trust, but you talked about mediators and people in the community, connectors, that whole notion of the glue, people who glue things together. So that's been a key part of the story. So thanks for raising that. And you also raised this thing which we talked about earlier, which was this question of replication and transfer. So where things work well, this is not a copy and paste, and you can't pick it up and drop it down somewhere else, but we can learn from one another. So how we do that is also really useful, and part of this wider conversation is about across Europe, how can we find things that work and how can we adapt them and replicate them in other places. So thanks a lot, Joe. Stay with us because we'll bring you back into the conversation shortly. Let's jump from Poland back to Scotland. Let's bring in Linda. I can see you on the screen there, Linda. It's Linda Cameron, who's the Provan Hill Housing Association Chair of ERA. You saw the ERA video earlier on. Linda, really nice to see you. If you just pop your microphone on, you can come into the conversation, because I guess you've been central to this story of transformation in Provan Hill, and also through what's been happening in Easterhouse. So again, thanks for joining us. We've got a couple of images we're going to share on the screen, which will maybe help illustrate your story. So thanks so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours, Linda.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope everyone can hear me okay.
Yeah.
Good. Just an insight into what ERA does. We've got photos of Easterhouse back in, I'd say, the late 70s, early 80s. Really desolate looking, and the houses were just atrocious. There was no repairs being done, and we were kind of left on our own. There was no community facilities. Transport links to the city centre were near enough non-existent. So the 8 housing associations within Easter House, we all got together, and in 1991 we set up the group called ERA. Now within the ERA there's 8 housing associations, and together we have 5 community facilities. We also do joint working. This saves on staff costs, although there's no real contract cost savings, but we do get other benefits from working together. We get apprenticeships. We also get community benefits. We have done, we do donations to local youth groups. We arrange painting and decorating classes for our tenants and residents. That tenants had asked for that. As ERA, we also have a collective voice. So this enables us to attract a high level of speakers to all of our meetings. The likes of our MP, MSPs, local councillors and SFHA. We also do joint funding bids for wider role. We've just got 6 electric cars which we use for our tenants. Our tenants can access these cars for hospital visits and other things that they might need transport for. We also do local democracy studies, and that's looking at how we can provide more council services locally, but at a more efficient cost, and create jobs and training opportunities for local tenants and residents. As part of the 8 housing associations, we also do job shadowing, and that is for staff and committee members, and that's part of ongoing training and development for both staff and committee members. During the start of COVID, we had a response team that was set up within days of the lockdown, and most of the housing associations work directly with community groups, and this was to make sure that our most vulnerable tenants and residents had folk there on the ground delivering food parcels, making sure that they had enough money to cover fuel costs, etc. Most of the housing associations are small. Within the 8 housing associations, we have just under 4,500 houses between us. And because we're small, we can respond very quickly to a host of different things that might pop up, like so maybe for policies that aren't working and we see that they're not achieving the outcomes that we were looking for, so we can make changes to these policies at a committee meeting. We also do I've lost the plot. To say that all the housing associations, the committee members across here are all local tenants and residents, and we've been able to sustain and grow for the past 30+ years. We're still building new houses. We're still viable with money in the bank. We're able to maintain our stock and the local environment as well. We work with the local community to give them back ownership. And one of the tenants that you saw on the slide had actually said that they have more pride and ownership of the area. To start with the housing associations, as you all well know, it was built on bricks and mortar. But now we have a greater, wider role agenda, welfare benefits advisors, income maximisation. We support youth clubs, lunch clubs, pensioners clubs, home working clubs, walking clubs. We also have allotments, job clubs, volunteering opportunities, but we also have a bigger impact on the community, because now, back in the 80s, we didn't have any shopping centres or that, so we've got shopping centre now. Our transport link is absolutely fantastic, to going from Glasgow into city centre. We've got a massive big supermarket, we've got a theatre and a cinema. We also have private house builders. If I think, in my opinion, if the housing associations weren't established in Greater Easterhouse, I don't think we would have half as much as what we've got here now. And all of our waiting lists in Easterhouse are overflowing. People that had stayed in Easterhouse before and left, they now want to come back.
Brilliant.
We have a history and a heritage, and that's going to grow.
And also a future, by the sounds of it.
Yes.
Brilliant. Linda, thanks so much for sharing that. And those photographs are really kind of striking. What a transformation, incredible story. And we've got a couple of questions, so we'll come back to, because Julie's asking, how do we make sure people stay involved? How to make sure tenants don't just get involved when there's a problem, reacting to something, and then they disappear again. So let's come back and pick that up with you shortly, because I think that's a really kind of key thing for us to pick up on. There's an earlier question as well about homelessness, and we've talked about that. People who are worried about evictions and everything else. Again, that's an issue. We'll maybe come back to that. But let's carry on going around our panelists. Thanks a lot, Linda. Nice to see you. We'll come back to you shortly. Let's stay in Northern Europe, but let's go from Scotland to Denmark. Let's bring in Flemming Leuvenhart. Flemming, great to see you.
Thank you.
It's nice to talk to you the other day. We had a quick chat on the phone, and again, you shared some really good images with us, which tell the sort of transformation from your perspective. Again, maybe just introduce yourselves, tell us where you fit in, and then the floor is yours. Thanks very much.
Thank you. My name is Flemming Leuvenhart, and I live in Copenhagen. I have lived here for 27 years now. It only should be 2 years, but we are still living here, my wife and I. Around 18 years ago, we started a facade renovation. And I would like to speak a little about the process, because it was very, very good. It all started with that the tenants or the residents voted for a budget. And one of our concern was that the architect want to make a monument that they could be proud of, and we should live in it. So we had some demands that we wanted to have some influence on how the renovation should go, and what and how the facade should look like afterward. And we started a project where groups of tenants worked with different subjects. And as you can see on the facades, the choice of colors and glass and stuff like that, it's all things that we have decided. And of course, we have to pay for it. But I will say that we had a renovation project that we are very proud of. And one of the things that we gained from this project was that people across age and social status in our afdeling here, they learned each other, to know each other. And today we have a lot of social meeting in the courtyards where people in the summer weather go down with a cup of coffee and speak with each other. And under the COVID-19 here in the spring, where Denmark was locked down, we made something that the people who was exposed to get COVID, we others, we go to the supermarket and bought food for them and stuff for them. So we are a department of 578 flats, and we are known for we help each other no matter what. So I will say it is a very good process. And if you take the playground, my department here is known by that people are in a high age, so we don't have very many families with children. But if you see the playground, I see if can you put this on the screen, or shall I do it?
Yeah, can we just pop to the, can we jump to the nice image of the playground that we showed earlier on? Yeah.
This one was drawn or made in 2002. And it was the architect company who's contacted the local primary school with some children, and they draw this playground, and it's the children's idea. It's called Bumped Metro, and it was after 9/11, and this was what the children had in their mind. I know it now needs some painting, and we have a plan for that. But the children really used the playground because it was their playground and not just something that the adults made for them. They made it for themselves. And then if you can see the balcony, if you can go one picture back, we also in the process that individual could chose to have their own balcony. We have on the other side of the building, but as an extension, and then they had to pay for it themselves. It's around €100 a month for having a balcony, but it's very popular. So in the building process, there was a lot of individual choices where people could say, okay, we just don't want the basic, we want more. So they could get added value, and it's only the apartment who is paying for that. It's not all of us who pay for the extras that apartment has made as an add value. I don't know what more I have to say. I will I will answer questions, but I don't know what more to say about it.
That's great, Fleming, and I really like the way you started by talking about architecture. This architects had this grand plan for some sort of monument, and in a sense that kind of triggered a reaction. And you've also talked about the importance of having a shared space to connect socially, and that's been a difficult, especially important during this COVID period, as you said. And I really like the way in which some of these photographs gives us a sense of the diversity of the different situations, from Joanna's pictures in Poland to what you're showing us here. It really helps us understand, exactly what the local scenario is like. And we've got quite a few questions on the chat. So let me come back to you, and we'll bring you in shortly, Fleming, and ask, we maybe open this up to the panel. So thanks for getting us started. Thanks for giving us a view of how things look. And we'll jump now to Paris. Let's go to Raphaël Darmercourt, who's with the l'Union Sociale pour l'Habitat in France. Again, just share with us maybe a little bit about your own situation, Raphaël, who you are, what you do, and maybe in this conversation about transformation, in these discussions about how we involve residents and tenants in decision making. Just maybe share with us some of the things that your organization is doing, and then we'll maybe go back to the chat bar and bring in some of our participants with some questions. Raphaël, okay. Nice to see you, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Eddie. Thank you for inviting me. I will be at another scale from what we've just seen, because we represent all the social housing providers in France, or most of them. And so what I do at the Union Sociale pour l'Habitat is specifically, we have a team to deal with mostly the renovation program that has been put in France since 2003. Before I go a little bit into that, I would just want to tell you from where I speak, meaning social housing in France is 4.5 million housing units, of which 1.4 million are in places that have been considered as a priority for urban renewal, which means it's 31% of all the social housing that is concerned. So how do we undergo transformation in these neighborhoods is a real big question that almost every social housing provider has to take into account. I won't go into details about the National Urban Renovation Program, but there has been two. Just to give you a few ideas, the pictures you see are from the first program that has been led by social housing providers. Knowing that there's a first program that went on from 2003 to 2014. And then a second one. And in the second one, we learned from what we could improve and that what conclusions we could take on what we did in the first program. Here, I'd like to quote someone everybody knows, which is Gandhi, who said, "Whatever you do for me without me, you do against me." And I think this was a bit forgotten at the beginning of the programs that were led in France. And the social housing providers have developed skills over the time and ongoing from a very technical approach around how the building works or doesn't work, what we have to do to refurbish it, how we have to decide on which ones we have to demolish, either because they're just outdated or because we can, instead of this building, have a new road network that will help connect the district in itself, but also with the other districts around. And so progressively, we've come from a technical way of seeing things about the building, about the urban functions, to how we can invest the people who use these buildings, who use these social housings and public spaces, how they can invest the project and make it theirs. And at first, it was a real challenge. Progressively, some of the French housing providers have developed real skills, and usually it comes with a shift of looking at things, and the tenant is not just only a tenant but a citizen with ideas, with a capacity of making things, making them great. And especially we've noticed that when the first people concerned by the project are involved in the project, then they respect this same project and make it theirs. And in the end, it ends up by more well-being in a new environment, and especially not falling into the trap, I don't know if it's the right word, but of maybe having an expert idea of what should be done, and then in the end we're just on the side, not exactly in what the people would want. And then it would be it would be a shame to conclude at so much money involved in these projects and not having solved what is the heart of the problem or the heart of the preoccupation of the people who live in these districts. So as yearly today, that question of how the social housing providers develop skills in public consultation and workshops with the tenants, but also with other users of these places, involving also their employees in all the project is really important. And so we also have lots of example of or increasing example anyways of providing and increasing the number of services that come with the projects towards the people, whether their social unit is refurbished or not, or demolished or not, whether they have to go through a relocation phase that is usually a bit difficult. So I don't know if it's the same in other countries, in other European countries. In France, we have had for a few years the possibility for social housing providers to use a tax relief system that is specifically intended to finance actions in the districts with the people, and to help upcycling rubbish, for example, to help people access to healthy food. We talk a lot about local urban agriculture and access to health, to employment, and to educational and cultural projects. So we don't do this alone. We do it in partnerships with local deciders, but also local associations, and most of all, the daily involvement of the employees in the housing, social housing units. And maybe you'll give me the possibility to talk about the conclusions we had on what the added value of social housing brought in the situation of the COVID crisis, because it was pretty interesting to see how the fact that we had worked these questions before and had links made it possible to have a good response in a short time.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, can we come back to that shortly? Because I think I mean, the good thing about these sessions is you never know where the conversation is going to go. So sometimes you have a lockdown scripted PowerPoint, and we all know what's going to happen, and it's all a bit linear and a bit flat. But the nice thing about this is we don't quite know where the conversation is going, and a couple of things which are popping up. So one is Judy's question. Judy Lawson, who's on our first panel, who's involved in the Housing 2030 work, is asking, how do we sustain and maintain people's involvement? How do we make sure they don't just turn up when there's a crisis or a big thing and then they go away again? So, Linda talked about being in it for the long term. What kinds of things work in terms of mobilizing people and making sure they're engaged? So that's our first thing. There's a question about homelessness, and vulnerability and precariousness, which I might ask Dara to come in and just say a little bit about, because I can't see that on the chat line. And then there's a really interesting conversation also about the kind of legislative tools we have. But first of all, this key question about how we maintain motivation. I'll maybe ask you first of all, Linda, if you're sharing tips, because we saw earlier on that all of our situations are different. If you're in a place where there isn't this history of community-led and active participation, what are the kinds of things which have worked in the long term to keep people involved and keep them connected in neighbourhoods like Easterhouse and Provenhill that you've been talking about? I think you're on mute, Linda. Just click your...
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you find that? Thanks.
I think the key to that one is keep tenants and residents informed listen to what they have to say, and where possible, every tenant has different needs, and if you can be open-minded and keep an open mind to the needs of the tenants will come along with you. So for me, it's listening to what their needs are. If we can help, we will do it. We won't ignore it. If we can't help, we will find a solution to bring our tenants along with us. But the key point is to listen to what they have to say, because they're the ones that keep our community alive, keep it fresh, and the younger generation, we've got to bring them along with them. So we listen to the younger generation as well.
Okay, great, thank you. And we talked one of the things in this conversation too is about lived experience versus kind of professional expertise. You know, one of the risks is that people who are housing professionals think they know the answers and that people living in neighborhoods don't. So this whole thing about making space for lived experience and as you say, listening to and respecting the, you know, what people who live in neighborhoods bring to this. Craig, I mean, you'll have given lots of thought to this as well, this whole thing about how we listen to people, how we involve them in the long term. Any kind of tips you'd share or thoughts on what works from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fundamental. These the communities that are there are the people who are experiencing place and feel the impacts of what's going on. So I think there's a few interesting strands in that. One is in terms of the evolution. I think we've talked about kind of regeneration projects. That's a long-term thing. So it's how we evolve. Consultation, engagement, those conversations as projects move along, and also engaging the right people. And I think Linda kind of touched as well on that generational thing, and we find that in some of the areas where it's maybe the same people who are involved in our conversations as in local community groups, and so it's trying to widen our audience. COVID's maybe also a way that's accelerated some of that in terms of virtual platforms. So we're seeing consultation move online, and that maybe reaches a different section of communities. But there's still a need, you know, with digital exclusion. So we still have newsletters and things that go out and capture our more traditional groups. I think it's just finding the right communication tools and making sure that, you know, we're delivering on what we're saying, and being really clear about what is happening. So we do have that trust with people, and that we, you know, trying to keep people engaged, and find if we, you know, don't feel that we've got enough engagement there, it's then working with the local groups that have that engagement, and that's the purpose of the delivery groups that we have in terms of, you know, going out there and disseminating information and bringing more people in as is necessary.
Yeah, okay. And you talked about kind of structures, delivery groups having, you know, sort of mechanisms that do that. I mean, Ben, do you want to just jump in here and say, because I know in the chat you said something about the Danish situation where you have a kind of legal requirement to involve tenants in decision making. Just say a little bit about how that works, and then I'm going to go to Joe and Poland to tell us a bit more about the Wood situation.
Yes, in Denmark we have tenants democracy at the local level in the local housing area, and it's the tenants have the majority at the local level in the housing area and in the housing association. And as Fleming told before, when you have this big renovation, the tenants have to vote pro this renovation, and if they vote no, there will be no renovation. So it's institutionalized in the Danish system, tenants democracy with tenants majority at each level in the housing association.
Interesting. And you've shared a bit about that in some links, so that's really, really helpful for us to hear about. So thanks for that. And you know, I listen to that and I think, well, why are we not all doing this? If it, you know, that's such a simple solution, you know, why are we not all doing this? And maybe Joe, I will just bring you back in. So you talked earlier about you've been involved in a transfer network. You've been thinking about how things work in your own situation and how that can be adapted elsewhere. So I guess, first of all, you mentioned mediators. Any other tips for sustaining involvement? And then maybe say a few words about your transfer experience and why it seems so difficult for us to adapt things that work and you know, make them work elsewhere.
Okay, so basically, if I was to say or answer the question how to keep this communication between tenants, residents and the administration, I would say that in case of which mediators play a great role, because they are the front desk, they are the front men to whom the residents from the revitalization area can approach anytime with any problem almost. So they are the connectors, the most feasible ones. But apart from that, working on within the UOG, I can say that what is extremely important are the local leaders, because we as city officers cannot be in every neighborhood, cannot facilitate, support, animate every single local community. So we need these local leaders, these front men who will support us and create, in a sense, a network of people who take advantage of the opportunities that municipality offers. And to give you a different example, apart from revitalization, because this is a different story where we deal with neighborhoods that are being created in the process of revitalization, because for now we dismantled them because we moved people out for the time being of the renovation. But we have a civic budget every year, and we observe that there is a tendency that the number of applications that is being submitted declines, where at the very beginning there was huge enthusiasm, and we saw some very strong local neighborhoods that applied a lot of fantastic ideas and projects to be carried out with the finance from the municipality. But now I see, I don't know, maybe because of the COVID pandemic, that people do not communicate with each other anymore. And there are some neighborhoods or some areas in the revitalization area, the greater one, that do not submit any projects, that do not submit any applications to change their nearest environment. And to give you an example, from this year, we had 2 applications exactly from the same area, which was about greening the place and making it more environmentally friendly. And they were competing with each other. And we had to connect leaders of these applications because none of them knew that they applied for the same funds in the same call that we announced. So in terms of this facilitating this communication and this constant cooperation, I would say that local leaders are key. And when I speak of transfer, and my experience from the urban regeneration mix, I would say, as you mentioned at the very beginning, it's not like copy paste. Each and every city is different, and we have different problems and different potentials. They might be similar to each other, so we inspire each other and we adopt and adapt some bits and pieces. Sometimes it's a small scale solution, and we try to transfer it, to transport it on our ground, because it's different. So what I said is that we were inspired by our colleagues from Braga and Birmingham, and saw how their this animation activity, but based on the role of a local tenant, did wonderful things, because people living in the same area, like residents, they started to get to know each other. But this was the charisma of one person, and we wanted to replicate this. And looking at our experience from our colleagues from Toulouse, who are on a different level of their, let's say, civic engagement and participatory approaches, they have project managers, people who are like multitasking managers who run very complex projects on the neighborhood. We can't do this. We don't have this capacity. We don't have that money, and we are not mature enough to transfer it. But this is something that we are going to aim at.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So that's interesting, because sometimes we see things and we could say we would love to do that, but it wouldn't work here, and it wouldn't work here in that way. So we have to kind of dismantle it, walk around it, reassemble it in a way that fits our own environment. So again, it's a creative process. So, but it's also inspiring to see things which work elsewhere, because sometimes we get stuck in a cul-de-sac, we have to come out and go back in again, and it's just good to open our horizons. Raphael, I'll maybe come back to you, because Joe mentioned the changing kind of atmosphere because of COVID, and the kind of dynamic which is obviously still ongoing and still with us, sadly. And you mentioned that you've been doing some interesting research work around attitudes and how that's impacting upon how communities connect. Can you maybe say a little bit more about that? Because I think that'd be interesting
Yeah.
for us to hear.
Research, yes, but research is a bit of a big word. Is no, I think it should be really interesting to specifically have very serious research on the subject. But for us, it seems like a conclusion that the fact that already the social housing providers being in contact with local associations that can provide services to the people who live in those neighborhoods, it was easy, or at least really quick, possibly quick to react and find solutions for people who were completely isolated and couldn't get out of their homes, for the eldest, for the single parents, for example, to try to find solutions for the homework to be simply have access to a printing machine to have the homework for the kids was not so evident. So we have the conviction that social housing is a cradle for solidarity and sociability, and that once you have developed, I talked about the skills, but I think it's really the right words. It's the skills, the process, identifying either within the employees of the social housing providers or the with partnerships, people who can be in that instant and direct relation is very important. So I was thinking about a few things when listening to Linda and Joanna. I was thinking that when Linda said one of the keys is to keep an open mind and be able to listen, what we see is that they're not, it would be lying to say that they are all really up leveled on these skills, but some of them who are really up front of the others, it's actually a new way of looking at the tenants, but also at their own organization and the employees. And you have to be open-minded towards everybody, including the people inside, not just the tenants, but including the employees who can bring gorgeous ideas, but they just don't have they're not director, so they think they are not allowed to express a good idea, whereas once you sort of free the ability to speak, and knowing you will be respected in what you will say, then as it becomes a sort of philosophy in the for the social housing provider. Ideas come, and in the end, I was talking with one of them a few weeks back. Sometimes that question about how you can sustain the involvement is no more a question, and the thing is more like, how can we stop the ideas because we cannot follow when you start freeing the capacity of people to express their needs, and you have satisfied the first needs, then you can go much further, and you can go much further on sustainability. Sorry, it's very difficult to say for me in English, but you can go really far, and I'm hoping that it will be largely spread in the next coming years.
Great. Okay, Raphael, thank you so much. When we start sessions like this, we think we've got loads of time, and sadly we're about to bump up against the end. We've got a couple of other questions which are hanging, and we're not going to have time to pick them up just now. So my suggestion is I'm going to invite Dara to just flag those questions with us. If you, either on the panel or on the audience, have thoughts on these questions, suggestions, material to share, and people are already sharing links, which is super, super helpful, then let's pick them up that way. We can carry on the conversation after today, but we're going to have to close shortly. But Dara, before we do that, and before we go to our final session, do you want to just jump in and just flag those questions with us so the audience knows what they are and maybe they can pick up on some responses?
Sure, yeah, again, thank you, Eddie, for this moderating this great panel, and thank you to all the speakers. It's been fantastic. So there's been a huge amount of activity in both the chat and the Q&A, and I won't have time here to flag even half of what's been said or what's been brought up, but just one or two that I'd like to mention. So again, from the Director of FIANCE here in Brussels, Freek, he was talking in relation to this morning's OECD report, which flagged the need for greater investment, particularly in social housing for homeless families or people experiencing homelessness. How can we build those sort of good frameworks that allow and enable social housing providers to do more for homeless people, and what kind of good policies can we think about? He specifically mentioned the good work being done in Scotland, where a very high percentage of new lettings for social tenants are actually going to people experiencing homelessness. So that's possibly a good example of good policy. Indeed, Julie Lawson mentioned how can we engage tenants not just when there's a problem, but when there's on an ongoing basis, you know, in the good times and the bad, I suppose. Someone wondering whether or not Scotland has a very rich tradition of community activism, and maybe that in Scotland kind of helps to inform the policy that's being made by some of the providers, and maybe in other countries that the same spirit of community activism isn't there, and that could maybe mean that Scotland actually has an advantage in kind of the sort of policies that we've talked about today. There's something to think about. Alicia, and I think we've covered this a little bit already, our colleague here in Housing Europe, Alicia Pettini, was kind of wondering how have we managed to maintain a sense of community in social housing during these times of social distancing. So how do we act as a community when we can't actually be together as a community physically? So again, it's something really interesting. It kind of brings a new dynamic to the community element of social housing providers. And just one final comment from Barbara from the International Union of Tenants, who really was complimentary of Fleming's intervention, and indeed Bent by extension, and indeed the Danish model of tenant involvement. And basically she says that we need to institutionalize tenant participation in housing and make that really a core foundation of providing quality housing for people. So again, that's just some of the comments. I could have spoken for 10 minutes, but really thank you to you, Eddie, to all the panelists, and to everyone who got involved in the chat and the questions. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks a lot, Dara, for just wrapping those things up for us. So some key questions there. We could talk for half a day about homelessness alone before we even start talking about the other things. But if you have suggestions, solutions, observations, comments to pick up on any of those points which Dara has just shared with us, then please, in the chat or in all the other channels we now have open to us, share them with us. I just would like to thank Linda, Raphael, Joanna, and Fleming for joining us, and also to Craig for a really rich, super discussion. Thanks for taking us down into your location so we get a real sense of what's going on. Stay with us, stay with the conversation. Thanks so much. We really appreciate your time, and we'll draw a line under the second panel session. We've got about 10 minutes to go, so we're just going to bring Sally and Bent and Sorka Edwards, who I think everyone here will know, who's obviously in the hot seat at Housing Europe, to come back into this final session. The idea here, as I said at the beginning, is to share our word cloud. I think in a minute, through the magic of technology, we're going to see, there's Sorka, hiya. We're going to see the word cloud on the screen. And when we do see that on the screen, I'm going to ask Sorka and Bent and Sally just maybe to give us some reflections on what we're going to see. Remember, we asked you all when we think about well, there's a question there. When we think about social value of housing, what are the key things you think about? Can we just magnify that a little bit? Because I can see the big words, but I'm not so good at seeing the ones which are kind of on the edges and the ones which are kind of small. Remember, the more people said these words, the bigger the words are in our picture there. But I think we're just trying to magnify that image there. I can see community obviously at the center. It's a bit like being at the opticians. I can see community in the center. I can see neighborhoods. I think I saw that there. It's disappeared now. It'll come back shortly. So we're just going to have a quick look at that. Then we're going to maybe ask each of our final panelists just to say a few key things about what they've picked up from what's been a really, oh, that's perfect, a rich discussion. And then we'll maybe wrap up by saying what's in our diaries and what's coming up that can help us keep connected to these discussions. So maybe first of all, Sally, maybe to ask you just to have a wee look at what we've got on the screen there. Anything surprising, anything that kind of jumps out from you in terms of those words that we can see?
I think, I mean, they're all the words I would hope to see and expect to see. So to see them there in their full glory and content is fantastic. I have to home in on community, given the session we've just had, which was so inspiring in all aspects and at all levels. Community for all of us is so important, not just in terms of how we live, in the homes we live in, the places we live in, but as professionals and in our personal lives. And I think we can all identify with that. It's not just about, you know, the community out there for tenants. It's about community and connection for all of us. So I think that's a fantastic, you know, front and center word on which everything else hangs.
Okay, fantastic. Ben, how about you? Just looking at the screen there, what some observations from your side?
Many of the same as Sally said, many of the words I hope to see, and we can see them now. And community is the biggest word. I think when we think of community and the panelists and speakers today, we have this is home. Is it a home or is it an asset? When we look at it, and I think community links, of course, to home and not as an asset. And when we talked about earlier about affordability, what is affordability? Needed for someone and good for everybody, affordability and the link to freedom. And we have also talked about the pandemic and how to deal with these things, to buy groceries for your neighbor and things like that. Many of these words, they are linked to the word community. So community is, in fact, it's very logical that community is the biggest word here. And I'm also, like said, very happy to see all of the words here linked together.
Okay. Sarka, how about you? It's great to see you, by the way, and you've done a brilliant job, as have your colleagues in Housing Europe, in getting this show on the road. So just looking at that kind of nice tapestry of words there, what's jumping out for you?
Opportunity. I think one of the most, we've had a brilliant time working and preparing this conference with the team, but I was really inspired by the community regeneration locally there in Scotland, particularly by the work of ERA. And there's one of the young gentlemen who's interviewed who talks about the fact that when he used to walk out of his door, he sort of said to himself, yeah, this is a bit of a mess here. This is not looking so good. And now he is actually the community officer working for the local housing association. Right. So I think what happened was he turned a problem was turned into an opportunity. And I think that's what the spirit of the work done in this local regeneration, community-led regeneration. And then, of course, the whole message there is that the focus of regeneration should be about giving people opportunities, giving community opportunities. But I must say, coming from our perspective here, I'm also looking at this word opportunity because of the OECD report that we heard. I can't forget what the hat I have on, but I think we also have a real opportunity here because there is definitely a sea change. We can't take it for granted, of course. There's a lot of work to be done, but yes, that was the word that jumped out for me.
Okay, great. And just as we wrap up today, lots and lots of things in play. We just mentioned the OECD, and we've heard about Housing 2030. People who are with us on the call today, who are part of this event, what are the key things you would kind of signpost them to? What, in terms of keeping the conversation going, things people need to be aware of, what's coming up that are the key kind of landmarks that you want to kind of make sure people know about before we sign off this morning? Sorka, do you want to pick us up on that?
Sorry, should I go ahead? Yes, I think for me, the biggest takeaway is I'm actually taken aback by the level of ambition here today. And I must say that when we first started talking about this conference and the title, and it's like over a year ago, and originally it was our colleague, former colleague Michalis Hudis, who put the title on the table, No Price Tag. And I found it too daring, I must say. It took us a while, a bit of discussion to actually put it, because obviously we're representing local housing providers who have to really take care with their budgets, with their limited budgets. So even for me, it was a bit of a challenge to actually go with that title. But I never would have imagined at that time that we would actually have a body like the OECD on board for that discussion. And I think the words of, we've heard about Nelson Mandela, we also heard about Gandhi today, so inspirational company. I think this is what is the most shocking. So the ambition that is on the table about really an opportunity to reframe it. But at the same time, we kept it real because we focused in at those projects on the ground to look at what is really involved there. So I think that for me was the main takeaway. It's just the fact that don't hesitate to push the frontiers, because you never know what can happen.
Brilliant, brilliant. Ben, I'll bring Sally in to finish off afterwards, but Ben, your key takeaways, I can see you nodding and connecting.
Yes, I think there are many key takeaways, but I think we have been around the community and the importance of the local community and what housing associations and what social housing is able to. But I will go back to OECD, because I think there are very important takeaways from the OECD. I have known them for many years. I've been in the Ministry of Finance, and they have also visited me here in my office in Denmark and looked very strange at me 10 years ago, said, "Are you into social housing now?" And now we are totally different, because so important points here, because OECD look at social housing as a key part of a well-functioning housing market. It's not regulated market versus the free market, but you have to look at them integrated, that you have to have a regulated market in order to have a well-functioning also free market. And what OECD, among other things, said here is that we have had a structural slump in investing in social housing, which is very important to look at social housing as a way to stimulate the economy, of course, now because we're in a slump, but also in the long run to look at the business cycles, to have a bigger part of the economy is social housing, to have a more stable macroeconomic development in the societies. So I think this is very important takeaways here. So as
brilliant
here in Housing Europe and as a professional economist, I'm quite happy.
Good stuff. Sally, you got us started with a really inspirational input today, and you know, I can see you've been connecting all the way through this. I mean, I guess a couple of final takeaways from your side. What are you leaving with today as we finish up? I think you're on mute, Sally. Just put your mic on. Yeah.
It's been so inspirational, and I've loved hearing everything from the Housing Europe family, which is how I feel about it now, to be very much involved and included in that, looking forward to the future of it, as Sorka's been talking about. For me, to follow on from what Bent was just saying, it's about having a business head and a social heart. And I think that social heart is the most important thing. As long as we've got that as our guiding star, then, you know, the world is our opportunity. and there are endless opportunities and no limits to what we can. I think more intervention in the market is what we need on a business in business terms, both in terms of housing and land, and in social terms, in terms of that heartbeat, then it's about well-being. It's about more than a home. Jacinda Ardern, who's Prime Minister in New Zealand, said that economic growth with worsening social outcomes is not success, it's failure. And we've got to implant that well-being mechanism and structure and measurement into our systemic economic growth measurements and systems that we have across Europe and across the world. And once governments start doing that, we start to get somewhere with social housing and all the other aspects of a good life. And I think the final thing I'd say is something that Raphael talked about, which really struck me. It's about being a citizen first for all of us, and about being a tenant and a resident second. That's not to say that's not important, but we're all citizens of Europe, all citizens of the world, citizens of our communities. And that's the most important thing. And that gives us a level playing field on which to work together for the good of everyone across Europe and across the world.
Wonderful. Thanks, Sally. You mentioned another inspirational person, Jacinda Ardern, who is doing incredible things. And we've been surrounded by inspirational people. You mentioned Michalis Gruzis, Sorka, earlier. Michalis is with us. I don't know if you're still with us, Michalis, but I know you're with us earlier on, and you got this ball rolling, so thanks for that. Thanks to an amazing team at Housing Europe. So to Abdu, to Diana, to Dara, who's been jumping in and out of the conversation. Thanks also to Sarah and to Karen at SFHA, who have been doing fantastic work also. There's a huge amount of energy and effort goes into making these things happen, as you all know. So, and thanks to all of you for joining us. We are all digitally saturated. We have to kind of be very selective about what we give our time to. You've given a lot of time to us today. We really, really appreciate it. Let's keep the conversation going. Let's keep our contacts and our networks going, because it's so important in times like this. Thanks to you, Sorka. Thanks to you, Ben, for leading the way and saying such great things in this final wrap up. Finally, thanks to you, Sally, for hosting us. Not in the way we thought, but it's still nice to have been in Scotland in not the way we expected, but better than nothing. And we hope to see each other physically in future, and hopefully this time next year in somewhere we can all be together in real time. Okay. Thanks a lot, everyone. Enjoy your adventures. Enjoy the rest of the day. Keep in touch, and thanks for joining us. Okay. Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye.